History often remembers moments, a single battle, a single coronation, a single fall of a city. Yet some stories cannot be contained within a moment. Some stories stretch across generations, reshaping the world not with a single blow, but with the slow pressure of centuries. The struggle between the Byzantine Empire and the Bulgarian state is one of those stories. It is a conflict that began in uncertainty and ended in exhaustion. A conflict that did not burn brightly and disappear but smoldered for 200 years, rising again and again as new rulers took the throne and new ambitions took root. It is a story of two nations locked in a contest for identity, survival and supremacy in a region that would one day become the crossroads of Europe. Imagine a world where borders do not hold for long, a world where a powerful empire, claiming the legacy of Rome, watches nervously as new peoples settle along its frontier. The Byzantines had seen many threats, but the arrival of the Bulgars and the Slavic tribes in the Balkans was different. This was not a raid or a fleeting incursion. It was the birth of a new state, a state that would not kneel easily, a state that understood the land, the rivers, the mountains, a state that carried within it the fierce determination of a people who refused to disappear. To the Byzantines, heirs of Constantinople, this was an affront. They believed themselves to be the center of civilization, the bastion of Christian authority, the last great flame of the Roman world. In their eyes, the Bulgars were newcomers who did not understand the meaning of true power. To the Bulgars, the Byzantines were a looming threat, a force that would swallow them if they ever showed weakness. The result was tension that grew with every passing year, every new generation, every shift of fortune. The conflict became more than a question of land. It became a question of identity. Would the Bulgars carve out their own place in history, or would they become another people absorbed into the Byzantine sphere? Would the Byzantines maintain their authority over the Balkans, or would they watch centuries of dominion slip through their fingers? These questions lingered over the region like a shadow, shaping the decisions of kings, nobles and warriors across 2 centuries. At the heart of the struggle was the memory of survival. The Byzantines had endured countless invasions, civil wars and crises. They saw themselves as resilient, tested by time. The Bulgars were equally hardened. Their early leaders believed that every concession, every treaty, every retreat could be fatal to the future of their people. Both nations carried deep collective memories. Both believed they were destined to shape the lands they occupied. Both refused to yield. This contest was not constant. There were periods of uneasy peace, times of negotiation, moments when diplomacy seemed to hold more promise than war. Yet beneath the surface, distrust remained. Every treaty was temporary. Every peace was only a pause. As new leaders rose, they revived old ambitions. The sons and grandsons of warlords inherited the grudges of their ancestors. The emperors who sat in Constantinople often grew up hearing stories of Bulgarian raids and humiliations. Bulgarian rulers were raised on tales of Byzantine betrayal and arrogance. The conflict did not fade, it merely changed shape. What makes this 200-year war remarkable is not simply its length, but its complexity. It was not a simple clash of armies. It was a struggle involving culture, religion, diplomacy, and economic pressure. It was a contest where a single defeat could shift the balance of power for decades. It involved personalities whose ambitions stretched far beyond their borders. It featured rulers who dreamed of uniting the Balkans, ruling from Constantinople, or pushing their enemies back into obscurity. It produced victories that transformed nations and losses that left scars still remembered today. The Byzantine Empire was a master of strategy. It used treaties, tribute, marriage alliances, and political manipulation with as much precision as it used swords and spears. For centuries, this strategy allowed it to maintain influence over lands far beyond its direct control. But the Bulgars proved more resilient than many earlier enemies. They adapted quickly, learned from defeat, reorganized their leadership, and built their own systems of governance. They forged alliances, embraced new religions, and refined their military techniques. What began as a loose federation of tribes slowly evolved into a structured and confident state, capable of challenging one of the most sophisticated empires in the world. Over time, the struggle became deeply personal. Byzantine emperors marched north, determined to prove their supremacy. Bulgarian Khans rode south, determined to assert their independence. Victories created pride that lasted for generations. Defeats created a hunger for revenge. Cities were razed. Fortresses changed hands again and again. Entire populations lived in fear of raids or retaliation. Chroniclers on both sides wrote histories that reflected their loyalties, each insisting that their own nation fought with righteousness and necessity. Yet despite all the suffering, or perhaps because of it, the conflict produced some of the most significant developments in Eastern European history. Borders were redrawn, cultures merged, religions expanded their reach. Literary traditions grew stronger. Political structures became more refined. What happened between Byzantium and Bulgaria was not merely destruction, it was transformation. The region that emerged at the end of this 200-year conflict was not the same as it had been at the beginning. For 2 centuries, generations were born into a world where this rivalry seemed eternal. They knew only tension. They knew only the uneasy coexistence of 2 powers locked in a contest bigger than any individual life. Old men told stories of battles their grandfathers had fought. Young rulers planned campaigns inspired by triumphs that occurred decades before they were born. Entire families lived and died, believing that the conflict would never truly end. This is the story of how an empire and a rising kingdom shaped each other. It is the story of ambition and endurance. It is the story of 2 peoples who refused to surrender their place in history. Above all, it is the story of how a war that lasted 200 years reshaped the identity of Eastern Europe, creating legacies that still echo across the region today. This is the beginning of that story. The story of the Byzantine and Bulgarian struggle begins in a world that was already changing. By the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire had survived centuries of pressures that might have shattered a lesser state. It endured invasions, internal rebellions, and religious controversies that shook the foundation of its society. Yet the empire still saw itself as the heir of Rome, clinging to the belief that it alone represented the true continuation of ancient imperial authority. After the reign of Emperor Heraclius, Byzantium faced a new and difficult landscape. The empire that had once commanded vast territories was now constrained by losses to the Persians and then to the rising power of the early Islamic caliphates. These losses weakened imperial control over distant provinces and forced the Byzantines to concentrate on the Balkans and Anatolia, regions that had become essential for the empire's survival. This new focus brought Byzantine attention directly onto the peoples who were moving into the Balkan Peninsula. Among these were the Slavic tribes, whose migrations were one of the most significant demographic changes of the era. The Slavs arrived gradually, forming settlements across vast areas, often in small clusters of communities that lived close to rivers and fertile land. They were not yet united by a single ruler or state. Instead, they were bound together through kinship and local leadership. The Byzantine Empire observed these migrations with growing concern. The Balkans had long served as the gateway to Constantinople from the north. If the region was lost, the empire would be exposed to new dangers. The Slavs, however, did not initially appear as a unified threat. They were numerous, but their political fragmentation gave Byzantium the hope that diplomacy and occasional military campaigns could manage them. This changed with the arrival of the Bulgars, a people whose origins likely lay among the steppe confederations north of the Black Sea. The Bulgars were militarily organized and accustomed to leadership structures that could bind large groups into a cohesive force. When they moved southward and crossed the Danube, they encountered the Slavic populations already settled in the region. Over time, these two groups formed a new political entity. Out of their cooperation emerged the First Bulgarian Empire, a state that was far more capable of organized resistance than any Slavic group had been before. Its early leaders recognized that survival required a strong central authority and a willingness to challenge Byzantine claims over the region. The founding of Bulgaria marked a turning point. For the first time in centuries, the Byzantine Empire faced a new state within the Balkans that was both ambitious and resilient. The early clashes between the Bulgars and Byzantines showed that neither side intended to yield control of the region. The Byzantines believed they had inherited rightful authority over the Balkans from Rome, while the Bulgars saw the land as their own, won through migration, settlement, and hard struggle. The two powers now stood face to face, each determined to shape the future of southeastern Europe. Byzantine diplomacy played a central role in this evolving rivalry. The empire had long relied on a sophisticated system of negotiation, alliance building, and political influence. It often used marriage alliances to bind neighboring rulers into agreements. It used gifts and titles to win loyalty from tribal leaders. It used trade privileges to reward cooperation and economic sanctions to punish defiance. This diplomatic tradition had allowed Byzantium to survive earlier threats, particularly in a world where many neighboring powers lacked comparable administrative structures. However, Bulgaria proved surprisingly difficult to manipulate. Its rulers learned quickly from Byzantine strategies. They watched the court politics of Constantinople, studied its methods, and adapted them to their own needs. At times they used diplomacy to gain advantages, but they also understood when force was necessary. Religion added another layer of tension. The Byzantine Empire was deeply Christian, and faith became one of the tools through which it projected influence. Conversion was often used to bring neighboring peoples into Byzantine cultural orbit. When Bulgaria accepted Christianity during the reign of Boris I, this moment changed the trajectory of the conflict. The Christianization of Bulgaria was not only a religious transformation, but also a political one. It brought the young state into a new sphere of diplomatic negotiations, as Bulgaria found itself balancing between the influence of the Patriarchate of Constantinople and the papacy in Rome. Christianity gave Bulgarian rulers new legitimacy, but it also intensified their rivalry with Byzantium, for the empire feared losing religious authority over its neighbors. Warfare was constant throughout this era. Both nations developed strategies that reflected their geography and resources. The Byzantines relied heavily on fortified cities, trained soldiers, and sophisticated military manuals that drew from centuries of Roman tradition. Their armies combined cavalry, infantry, archers, and siege engineers. Their leaders studied past wars in order to reform tactics and improve discipline. The Bulgars relied on horseback warriors, swift movements, fortified hill settlements, and the ability to adapt quickly to the terrain. They were skilled in ambushes, raids, and the construction of defensive earthworks. Their leaders often used mobility and surprise to counter the more structured Byzantine forces. The conflict lasted 2 centuries because neither side achieved a final victory. There were moments when one power seemed dominant, only to falter later. Bulgaria gained immense strength under rulers like Krum and Simeon. Byzantium regained power under the Macedonian dynasty and later under Basil II. Each side endured internal weaknesses, succession struggles, and external threats that shifted the balance again and again. The changing fortunes of war created a rhythm that spanned generations. Children grew into adulthood hearing stories of battles fought long before they were born. Rulers came to power determined to avenge past humiliations or reclaim lost territories. Families lived in border regions that changed hands repeatedly, leaving uncertainty about which laws they would live under. The conflict became part of life, part of memory, and part of identity. Chroniclers recorded these events with passion and bias. Byzantine writers often portrayed the Bulgars as dangerous adversaries or troublesome barbarians who needed to be subdued for the sake of Christian order. They emphasized Bulgarian victories as moments of Byzantine suffering and Bulgarian defeats as proof of divine favor for the empire. Bulgarian chroniclers, though fewer in number, reflected the pride of a rising kingdom determined to prove its worth against one of the most sophisticated states in the world. Each side wrote history in a way that honored its own leaders and justified its own actions. These written memories shaped how later generations understood the conflict and ensured that its legacy endured long after the final battles. The long arc of this rivalry shaped Eastern Europe in profound ways. It influenced the development of borders, languages, and religious communities. It affected trade routes, settlement patterns, and alliances that lasted for centuries. It contributed to the political culture of both nations, strengthening their administrative systems and military traditions. By the time the conflict began to fade, Byzantium and Bulgaria had transformed each other. Their struggle was not only destructive, but formative. This introduction sets the stage for a story that spans generations. It is a story of ambition, endurance, and transformation. It is the story of how two nations, forged in the pressures of war and diplomacy, shaped the future of a region that continues to carry the marks of their struggle. The origins of the long rivalry between Byzantium and Bulgaria lie in a century when the entire map of Eastern Europe was being rewritten. Neither power began as natural enemies. They became enemies because the circumstances of geography, migration, and imperial survival slowly pushed them toward confrontation. In the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire was already an ancient state. It had survived the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the rise of new enemies on all sides, and repeated internal struggles. Yet the world around it was shifting in ways that even the most experienced imperial strategists struggled to understand. The greatest of these shifts was the arrival of new peoples into the Balkans, peoples who would ultimately form the foundation of the Bulgarian state. These migrations were not sudden invasions, but long processes that changed the ethnic and political landscape of the region. The Slavs were the first to alter the stability of the Byzantine Balkans. They arrived in waves, crossing the Danube and spreading into areas that had been part of the empire for centuries. Their settlements formed quietly at first. They built wooden homes along rivers, cultivated land, and created communities based on kinship and local decision-making. The Slavic way of life differed from the urban traditions the Byzantines had known under Roman rule. They favored scattered settlements rather than large cities, and they organized themselves around tribal leadership rather than centralized authority. At first, the empire believed it could handle these newcomers through periodic military expeditions. Byzantine armies managed to repel some groups and negotiate with others. Yet the Slavs continued to move southward, filling the vacuum created by earlier invasions and the weakening of imperial control. The Slavic presence was not simply a passing phase. It marked a fundamental change because these communities were numerous and settled deeply into the land. Over time, they adopted the geography of the Balkans as their own. They grew familiar with its forests, its rivers, and its mountains. They farmed its soil and raised families across regions that had once been firmly Roman. This demographic change gradually weakened Byzantium's ability to govern the Balkans. An empire dependent on taxation and administrative oversight could not easily manage scattered settlements that acknowledged no central authority. Imperial officials found themselves confronting a region where the old structures had eroded and new ones had not yet formed. The arrival of the Bulgars added another powerful element to this shifting landscape. The Bulgars were not a Slavic people. Their origins likely lay among the steppe cultures north of the Black Sea, peoples accustomed to horseback warfare, clan leadership and mobile military strategies. When they moved southward, they did not come as scattered families, but as organized groups led by khans. Their political structure gave them advantages in warfare, diplomacy and state building. Their leaders commanded loyalty and could mobilize large groups quickly. When the Bulgars crossed the Danube and entered the Balkans, they encountered the already established Slavic communities. It was in the combination of Bulgar leadership and Slavic numbers that the foundation of the First Bulgarian Empire took shape. The relationship between these two groups was not simple conquest. The Slavs and Bulgars created a structure in which Bulgarian rulers provided military leadership, while Slavic communities provided manpower and local knowledge. Over time, the two identities blended. Slavic language and culture became dominant inside the new state, while Bulgar elite traditions shaped military and political organization. The result was a new political entity that neither Byzantium nor earlier neighbors had expected. This new Bulgaria had the population strength of the Slavs, combined with the military cohesion of the Bulgars. It was strong enough to challenge the empire and determined enough to defend its emerging identity. Byzantium viewed this development with caution. The empire was accustomed to confronting steppe warriors and Slavic settlers, but the combination of the two into a functioning state represented a unique challenge. The Byzantine Empire was a sophisticated political structure with centuries of experience, but it was also under immense pressure during this period. The Arab conquests in the east had removed large territories from imperial control. The treasury was strained, the army was frequently overstretched, and the administrative system faced disruption. In such circumstances, the loss of the Balkans would be devastating. The region served as a buffer protecting Constantinople from northern threats. It also provided soldiers, supplies and revenue. The rise of a new power in this region threatened the empire's long-term stability. The first major conflicts between Byzantium and the Bulgars emerged as the latter consolidated their position. The Byzantines attempted to prevent the formation of a Bulgarian state through military campaigns. They hoped that a swift attack would disrupt the new leadership and scatter the communities before they grew strong. However, the Bulgars proved more resilient than expected. Their victory at the Battle of Ongol demonstrated that they could stand against Byzantine forces and win. This victory did more than secure their territory. It signaled the birth of a state that would demand recognition from its powerful neighbor. For the Bulgarians, this early success helped form a sense of collective identity. It gave their leaders legitimacy and their people confidence. They could claim that their state existed because they had earned it through battle. This sense of pride would remain central to Bulgarian identity for generations. It also shaped their perception of Byzantium. The empire was not seen as a distant and untouchable power, but as an enemy that could be defeated. This view fueled later periods of expansion and contributed to the confidence of rulers like Krum and Simeon. The Byzantine perspective was very different. For centuries, the empire had seen itself as the rightful authority over the Balkans. The Slavic settlements were already difficult for the empire to accept, but the emergence of a unified Bulgarian state represented a direct challenge. It questioned Byzantine claims of supremacy, threatened imperial borders, and introduced a rival power capable of influencing other groups within the region. The Byzantines struggled to reconcile this development with their belief that they were the remaining guardians of Roman order. Their resentment blended with fear. They understood that if they did not contain Bulgaria early, it might grow into a long-term rival. These mixed pressures ensured that the relationship between Byzantium and Bulgaria began in hostility. Geography made them neighbors, and politics made them adversaries. The Balkans were not large enough to satisfy both ambitions. The empire wanted stability and control. Bulgaria wanted recognition and independence. Each side felt its future depended on how the other behaved. Distrust formed quickly and hardened over time. Treaties were signed, but rarely held for long. Each side questioned the other's intentions. Each interpreted even small actions as potential threats. By the 8th century, the outlines of the long rivalry were already visible. The Slavic migrations had transformed the region. The Bulgars had forged a functioning state. The Byzantine Empire was forced to confront an enemy that was becoming increasingly capable. The two powers lived in close proximity, sharing borders that neither side fully respected. Their ambitions collided whenever either monarch attempted to expand influence or secure new territories. Their fears constantly shaped their decisions. Their memories of past battles fed future suspicions. This was the world in which the 200-year conflict was born. It was a world shaped by movement, by adaptation, and by the relentless pressures that push nations into rivalry. Byzantium and Bulgaria did not become enemies by choice, but by circumstance. Their clash was the product of history unfolding in a region where identity, survival, and power were constantly contested. This was only the beginning. The reign of Asparuh and the first clashes. The figure of Asparuh stands at the beginning of Bulgarian history as a leader whose actions altered the balance of power in the Balkans. His reign marked the transformation of a migrating people into a recognizable state. The Bulgars had moved through the steppes for generations, shaped by hardship, conflict, and shifting alliances with larger steppe confederations. By the time Asparuh took command, they possessed both a tradition of leadership and the military experience needed to confront powerful neighbors. These qualities would prove essential as they approached the borders of the Byzantine Empire. The journey of Asparuh and his people into the Balkans was not a simple migration. It was the culmination of pressures coming from larger Eurasian forces. The great steppe confederations that had dominated regions north of the Black Sea were collapsing and reforming in rapid succession. The Bulgars were caught between rival tribes, shifting loyalties, and unpredictable political conditions. Asparuh recognized that remaining in this unstable environment threatened the survival of his people. He sought a new homeland where they could settle permanently, and where his authority could be preserved without constant interference from steppe politics. The lands south of the Danube seemed promising. They contained fertile river valleys, defensible positions, and scattered Slavic communities that could become allies rather than enemies. Byzantium observed the movement of the Bulgars with mounting concern. The empire had already witnessed the slow erosion of its Balkan territories as Slavic groups established themselves across the region. Now a more organized group approached the imperial frontier. Asparuh did not intend to become a subject of Byzantium. He intended to found a state. The Byzantines understood this ambition even before formal conflict began. To allow the Bulgars to settle would mean the loss of strategic territory and the rise of a rival power capable of challenging imperial authority. The empire had long relied on the Danube as a natural defense line. If that line were broken, Constantinople itself would be exposed to future threats. Asparuh settled his people near the mouth of the Danube, establishing fortified positions in a region that gave access to both defensive marshlands and open routes into the interior. The Slavic communities of the area were drawn into his orbit as allies. They recognized in Asparuh a leader capable of offering protection and stability. Slavic and Bulgar cooperation grew, forming the beginnings of a political structure that would eventually become the First Bulgarian Empire. This cooperation also worried the Byzantines. Slavs alone had not posed a unified threat, but under a Bulgar leader, they formed a population base large enough to sustain a durable state. The Byzantine response was guided both by fear and by a desire to restore lost authority. Emperor Constantine IV decided that the Bulgars must be confronted before their position became unassailable. He prepared a large military expedition intended to crush Asparuh's forces and reassert imperial control over the region. The Byzantines believed they could repeat previous successes against steppe peoples. They relied on the reputation of their armies, their disciplined formations, and the prestige of the imperial throne. They expected victory. Asparuh understood the seriousness of the threat. He prepared his defenses with great care, selecting territory that favored the tactics of his warriors. The Danube Delta offered marshes, narrow passages, and treacherous terrain that could neutralize enemy formations. Bulgar forces excelled in mobility, sudden attacks, and the use of natural landscapes to disrupt larger armies. They built defensive earthworks and prepared to lure the Byzantines into areas where their own advantages would be limited. The confrontation that followed is known as the Battle of Ongal. Although the exact details remain uncertain, chroniclers agree on its importance. When the Byzantine forces advanced, they struggled to maneuver through the marshlands. Their formations were broken, and their heavy equipment became a burden rather than an asset. Asparuh seized the opportunity. Bulgar warriors launched swift attacks from concealed positions, striking at the disorganized imperial troops. The speed of these assaults and the unfamiliar terrain overwhelmed the Byzantines. Panic spread through their ranks. The imperial army began to retreat, and the retreat quickly turned into flight. The defeat at Ongal was devastating for the Byzantine Empire. An army sent to destroy a rising power had instead been routed. Constantine IV withdrew, leaving Asparuh's position not only secure, but strengthened. The Bulgars now possessed a moral victory that would define their early statehood. They had defeated the empire that called itself the heir of Rome. This victory elevated Asparuh in the eyes of his followers and solidified the political structure he was building. It also signaled to Slavic communities that cooperation with the Bulgars could offer protection from imperial campaigns. The legacy of the Battle of Ongal extended far beyond the immediate military result. It forced Byzantium to acknowledge the reality of a new state on its northern frontier. The empire could no longer treat the Bulgars as a temporary problem to be crushed with a single campaign. Instead, it faced a rival capable of long-term resistance. The Byzantines reluctantly entered into negotiations that resulted in a treaty recognizing Bulgarian control over the lands they had occupied. This recognition was not merely symbolic. It marked the formal beginning of the First Bulgarian Empire. For the first time, the Bulgars held territory acknowledged by Byzantium through an official agreement. The new Bulgarian state emerged with a strong sense of purpose. Its identity was shaped by both steppe heritage and Slavic influence. Asparuh became the founder figure whose leadership had ensured survival and given his people a homeland. His followers and their descendants would remember him as the ruler who transformed wandering tribes into a nation. The memory of Ongal would be invoked by later Bulgarian leaders whenever they faced Byzantine aggression. It provided a narrative of victory that helped sustain resistance through difficult periods. For Byzantium, the defeat was a lesson in the limitations of imperial power. The empire had believed that a single campaign could restore control over the Balkans, but this belief proved false. The Bulgars had demonstrated the ability to adapt, to use terrain intelligently, and to mobilize their forces with determination. The empire now faced a rival that would not simply disappear. This realization forced Byzantium to reconsider its strategies. Diplomacy would become as important as warfare in managing relations with Bulgaria. Treaties, marriage arrangements, and negotiated alliances would shape future interactions as much as battles. The emergence of Bulgaria as a recognized power had profound effects on the region. Slavic communities now had a political center, a ruling elite, and a structure that offered protection and stability. This allowed Bulgar and Slavic identities to merge gradually. Slavic languages became dominant in daily life, while Bulgar traditions influenced military and administrative practices. This fusion created a unique cultural identity that would sustain Bulgaria through future conflicts. The rivalry between Byzantium and Bulgaria did not begin with hatred. It began with necessity. Asparuh needed land and security for his people. Byzantium needed to maintain control over its northern frontier. Their goals collided naturally. The victory at Ongal ensured that this collision would not end quickly. Instead, it became the starting point of a relationship defined by suspicion, competition, and shifting power dynamics. The first clashes between Byzantium and Bulgaria set the pattern for many of the conflicts that followed. The Bulgarians relied on mobility, clever use of terrain, and opportunistic strikes. The Byzantines relied on large armies, strategic planning, and imperial prestige. These differing approaches to warfare ensured that neither side could easily eliminate the other. Their rivalry would stretch across 2 centuries because both possessed strengths that counterbalanced one another. When one side gained an advantage, the other adapted. When one ruler suffered defeat, the next sought revenge. Asparuh did not live to see the full scale of the conflict that his victory had initiated, but his reign laid all the foundations. The existence of Bulgaria as a state, its recognition by Byzantium, and the memory of victorious resistance would shape generations to come. The empire that had once believed itself destined to rule the Balkans now faced a powerful neighbor that refused to be subdued. The Bulgars, once migrants seeking a new home, had become a nation with a stake in the political destiny of Eastern Europe. This was only the beginning of the long struggle. What followed would test the endurance of both nations and reveal the deep complexities of power, identity, and ambition that defined the medieval world. Constantinople reacts, diplomacy and resistance. The defeat at Ongal had shaken the Byzantine court in ways that chroniclers later tried to soften, but the truth remained clear. The empire had underestimated Asparuh. It had underestimated the strength of the Bulgar and Slavic alliance. It had underestimated how much the balance of power in the Balkans had already changed. The first reaction inside Constantinople was disbelief. The second was anger. The third was the realization that new strategies were necessary, because the old expectations of easy victories no longer matched reality. Emperor Constantine IV returned to the capital wounded in pride and burdened by the knowledge that his campaign had failed. His advisors debated how best to respond. Some argued for an immediate second offensive, believing that another attack might catch the Bulgarians before they solidified their position. Others warned that the empire could not afford another costly expedition so soon. The Arab threat in the east continued to demand attention. The treasury was strained. The people of the Balkans were no longer dependable subjects. In this tense moment, the emperor chose a course that signaled a new phase in Byzantine policy. He agreed to a treaty that recognized Bulgaria as a political entity north of the Balkan mountains. This treaty was reluctant, pragmatic, and humiliating, yet it bought the empire something it desperately needed: time. The agreement did not bring peace in the true sense. Both sides viewed it as a temporary necessity. For the Byzantines, the treaty allowed them to regroup, reorganize, and rebuild their forces. For the Bulgars, it confirmed their right to exist and secured valuable breathing room for strengthening their internal structures. Byzantium had long mastered the art of negotiating with peoples who lived on its borders. In the past, the empire had convinced tribes to accept tribute, titles, or settlement rights in order to keep them from invading. In the case of the Bulgars, however, this approach required careful refinement. The Bulgars were not simply nomadic riders who could be paid to withdraw. They were establishing a state that would eventually rival Byzantine influence. The treaty with Asparuh did not settle the conflict. It repositioned it into a political competition that would unfold over decades. Byzantine diplomats soon began working to undermine Bulgarian stability. They attempted to influence Slavic tribes in the region, hoping to pull them away from Bulgar authority. If the empire could weaken Asparuh's alliances, it could regain control without a full military campaign. The Slavs had once been independent communities with no overarching ruler. Some factions still preferred this autonomy. Byzantine envoys attempted to exploit old rivalries and tribal tensions. They offered gifts, trade privileges, and even promises of support. Yet Asparuh and his successors proved adept at reinforcing Bulgar control. The Slavs had long suffered from intermittent conflict, and the stability offered by the new Bulgarian state often outweighed the uncertain promises of the empire. Religious pressure became another tool in Constantinople's strategy. The Byzantines deeply believed that spiritual influence was an extension of political power. Missionaries were often sent into border regions not only to teach Christianity, but also to draw communities closer to Byzantine culture. The empire hoped that religious authority would bind Slavic groups to Constantinople and undermine Bulgar leadership, which at that time still maintained steppe beliefs mixed with tribal traditions. This religious outreach had limited success in the early decades, partly because the Bulgars remained firmly outside Christian influence, and partly because Slavic groups were not yet ready to accept imperial religious authority. Even so, the foundation was laid for future struggles in which conversion would play a central role. While diplomacy and religion worked quietly, the empire also prepared militarily. The army underwent reforms that sought to strengthen defensive capabilities in the Balkans. New themes were created, military districts that could raise local forces quickly and respond to incursions. Fortresses were repaired. Supply lines were improved. Commanders were assigned to watch Bulgar movements and report any changes in behavior. The Byzantines understood that Bulgaria was not a passing threat, but a permanent one. The empire had to adjust its strategy accordingly. Asparuh's successors were equally aware of Byzantine intentions. They knew that the empire would not accept the rise of a rival state in the Balkans without resistance. They also knew that treaties with Byzantium were rarely permanent. For this reason, they pursued their own diplomatic strategies. They strengthened ties with Slavic communities and ensured that Bulgar authority would not be easily undermined. They also expanded southward when opportunities arose, testing the limits of Byzantine tolerance. These early expansions were not yet major invasions, but they signaled Bulgarian confidence and the desire to shape the region's future on their own terms. The tension between the two powers grew slowly but steadily. Tribes along the frontier shifted allegiances depending on who offered better protection or more favorable trade conditions. Farmers and merchants in border regions lived under constant uncertainty. A settlement that paid taxes to the empire one year might find itself under Bulgarian rule the next. Some families adapted by forming alliances that would allow them to survive regardless of which power controlled their land. Others fled, moving deeper into imperial territory or farther north into Bulgar lands. The frontier became a zone of overlapping influences rather than a clear division. Inside, Constantinople debates continued over how to deal with Bulgaria in the long term. Some imperial advisors believed that the Bulgars would eventually fragment, especially if internal rivalries emerged. They urged patience. Others argued that only a decisive military strike could solve the problem. They insisted that waiting would allow Bulgaria to grow stronger and more unified. The emperors who ruled during this period struggled to balance these competing views. Their decisions were influenced by many factors, including threats from other regions, internal rebellions, and the unpredictable flow of political events. The empire's religious authorities also took a keen interest in Bulgaria. Christian leaders viewed the Bulgar state as an opportunity for future missionary work, but they also feared that non-Christian powers so close to Constantinople could encourage instability. The long-term goal of some church leaders was not merely to convert Slavic communities, but to bring the entire Bulgarian state under the influence of the Patriarchate. They believed that spiritual unity would eventually lead to political loyalty. While this vision would not be realized in the early stages of the rivalry, it revealed how deeply the Byzantines blended religion and statecraft. Despite all these efforts, Bulgaria continued to grow stronger. Its rulers developed administrative structures that supported expansion. They gained experience managing Slavic populations and integrating them into a broader political framework. The early decades of Bulgarian statehood were marked by consolidation rather than collapse. This stability forced the Byzantines to accept that Bulgaria was not a temporary challenge. It was becoming a fixture in the regional order. Treaties between the two powers were often made in the hope that they would prevent immediate conflict, but they rarely addressed the deeper issues. Byzantium could not accept a strong neighbor in the Balkans. Bulgaria could not accept Byzantine attempts to dominate its development. Tribute agreements, when imposed, were sometimes honored and sometimes ignored. Each side accused the other of failing to keep promises. Each interpreted diplomatic gestures according to its own needs. Resistance became a defining feature of their relationship. The Bulgarians resisted every attempt to limit their autonomy. The Byzantines resisted the idea that their authority was shrinking. Both sides believed they were fighting for survival. The empire believed that losing control over the Balkans would weaken its ability to protect Constantinople. Bulgaria believed that yielding to Byzantine pressure would erase the independence it had fought to obtain. The conflict therefore became more than political ambition. It became a struggle for identity. The early period of diplomacy and resistance defined how the rivalry would unfold in the centuries that followed. Neither side trusted the other. Neither saw compromise as a path to lasting peace. The victories and defeats of these early decades shaped the collective memories of both nations. Byzantines remembered Ongal as a humiliation that demanded revenge. Bulgarians remembered it as proof that they could build a state strong enough to stand against an ancient empire. This mixture of pride, fear, and ambition ensured that future generations would continue the struggle. The Balkans would become the battleground of competing visions. The empire sought order and influence. Bulgaria sought recognition and space to grow. Neither side could imagine a world where the other held dominance. This was the foundation of a rivalry that would last 200 years. Krum the Fearsome, the Bulgarian ascendancy. The rise of Khan Krum marked a dramatic escalation in the rivalry between Byzantium and Bulgaria. Asparuh's successors had established the foundation of the Bulgarian state, yet it was under Krum that the nation became a force capable of challenging the Byzantine Empire decisively. Krum emerged as a leader whose combination of military skill, strategic foresight, and political ruthlessness allowed Bulgaria to transition from survival to dominance. His reign is remembered not only for the victories he secured, but for the way he reshaped the balance of power in the Balkans. By the time Krum came to power, the Byzantine Empire had endured decades of intermittent conflict with Bulgaria. Some emperors had relied on treaties, tribute, or temporary truces to manage the threat. These approaches had limited success. Each Byzantine attempt to assert dominance revealed weaknesses in their strategy and revealed the growing competence of the Bulgarians. Krum inherited a state that was already strong enough to resist, but he understood that Bulgaria's survival and future influence depended on decisive action. He moved quickly to consolidate internal power, securing loyalty among Bulgar elites and integrating Slavic communities more firmly into the administrative and military structure of the state. Krum's ambitions were clear from the outset. He sought to expand Bulgarian control, punish Byzantine aggression, and establish a position of superiority in the Balkans. His military campaigns displayed a remarkable combination of tactical innovation and brutal efficiency. The emperor's armies, accustomed to dominating fragmented tribes and smaller states, now faced a centralized force with disciplined cavalry, disciplined infantry, and sophisticated planning. Krum exploited the weaknesses of the Byzantines, often luring imperial forces into terrain that favored the Bulgars' mobility and local knowledge. One of the earliest demonstrations of Krum's power came in his campaigns against the Byzantines in Thrace. Byzantine armies advanced expecting routine victories. They assumed that a campaign against Bulgaria would be similar to prior engagements. But Krum had learned from every confrontation. He anticipated imperial movements, prepared defensive positions, and employed ambush tactics that struck fear into the hearts of enemy commanders. The results were devastating. Byzantine forces suffered repeated defeats. Units that were considered elite were routed or destroyed. Imperial generals who had once been confident were forced into retreats. The victories established Krum's reputation not only as a capable commander, but as a leader whose authority was absolute. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of Krum's early reign was the sack of Adrianople. This city, a critical center for Byzantine administration and trade in the region, had long represented imperial strength in Thrace. Its capture shocked the empire and demonstrated the vulnerabilities that Byzantium had failed to address. The operation was meticulously planned. Krum understood the importance of timing, intelligence, and morale. His forces encircled the city, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. When the defenders attempted to resist, they faced a combination of relentless assaults and psychological pressure designed to break their will. The fall of Adrianople was not merely a military triumph. It was a symbolic statement. It proved that Bulgaria could strike at the heart of Byzantine-controlled territory and emerge victorious. The sack of Adrianople sent reverberations throughout the empire. Constantinople itself was forced to confront the reality that the Balkans were no longer fully under Byzantine influence. The defeat challenged the perception of imperial invincibility and shook the confidence of both military and civilian populations. Traders, officials, and peasants in border regions realized that Bulgarian power could no longer be ignored. Diplomatic strategies alone would not contain Krum. Military reform, careful planning, and a willingness to confront the reality of a rising rival became necessary. Krum's victories also transformed Bulgarian society. The success in battle and the acquisition of territories strengthened the central authority of the Khan. The loyalty of the elite was secured, and the integration of Slavic communities progressed. Resources gained from victories, whether in tribute, loot, or territory, allowed the state to maintain armies, build fortifications, and organize administrative structures capable of sustaining prolonged conflict. The rise of Krum marked the transition of Bulgaria from a regional power focused on survival into a state capable of asserting influence across the Balkans. Byzantium's responses during this period illustrate the increasing challenge of dealing with Krum. The empire could not simply rely on tribute or treaties. Emperors attempted campaigns to regain lost ground, yet they often found themselves outmaneuvered. Krum's understanding of Byzantine tactics allowed him to anticipate sieges, outflank armies, and exploit weaknesses in supply chains. When the Byzantines mounted large-scale operations, they frequently encountered well-prepared defenses, intelligence networks, and the ability of Krum to respond rapidly to emerging threats. The empire's sense of superiority was repeatedly undermined, creating a pattern of escalating conflict that would define relations for decades. Krum also understood the psychological dimensions of war. The display of Bulgarian power was not limited to battlefields. The sack of Adrianople and other successful campaigns served as warnings to neighboring states and internal factions. Krum's reputation for decisiveness, courage, and ruthless efficiency dissuaded potential internal dissent, and signaled to Byzantium that future confrontations would demand serious preparation. Fear became a tool of statecraft, reinforcing loyalty within Bulgaria and projecting authority beyond its borders. The ascendancy of Krum created a turning point in regional power. Where once Byzantium had assumed dominance in the Balkans, it now confronted a rival capable of challenging imperial authority on multiple fronts. The balance that had existed in the decades following Asparuh's founding of Bulgaria was replaced by a dynamic in which the Byzantines were increasingly reactive. Their strategies shifted from assumption of control to cautious engagement, combining diplomacy, tribute, and occasional military expeditions. The Bulgarians, in contrast, were proactive. Krum demonstrated that determination, strategic insight, and the ability to unify diverse populations could allow a rising state to seize the initiative. This period also highlighted the importance of leadership in shaping the course of medieval states. Asparuh had laid the foundation, but Krum transformed it into power capable of influencing the trajectory of an entire region. The character of the ruler, his ability to inspire loyalty, and his tactical acumen were decisive factors in the creation of enduring political structures. Under Krum, Bulgaria emerged not merely as a state resisting Byzantine domination, but as a power that Byzantium had to reckon with seriously in every military and diplomatic decision. The legacy of Krum's reign persisted long after his death. His campaigns, victories, and administrative reforms established a precedent for future Bulgarian rulers. They inherited a state strengthened by military success and by the integration of diverse populations. They faced an empire that had been humbled and had learned caution. Krum's actions created a historical memory that defined the rivalry between Byzantium and Bulgaria, providing both inspiration for Bulgarians and a cautionary tale for Byzantines. Krum the Fearsome represents the moment when Bulgaria moved from the periphery of imperial concerns to the center of regional politics. The victories he achieved, especially the sack of Adrianople, demonstrated that Byzantium was not invincible. They redefined the expectations of what a state in the Balkans could accomplish. This ascendancy marked a decisive phase in the long rivalry, showing that 200 years of conflict would be characterized not only by repeated clashes, but by the enduring significance of leadership, strategy, and the capacity to transform circumstances into lasting advantage. Krum's reign thus stands as a turning point in the regional order. The Bulgarians had proven they could dominate the battlefield, consolidate political structures, and resist imperial attempts at suppression. Byzantium learned that military strength alone was insufficient to maintain control. Both states entered a period in which diplomacy, warfare, and cultural influence would become inseparable elements of a rivalry that would endure for centuries. The events of this era set the tone for the ongoing struggle, establishing patterns that would influence the course of Balkan history and define the relationship between Bulgaria and Byzantium for generations to come. Emperor Nikephoros and the disaster at Pliska. The reign of Emperor Nikephoros marked a pivotal moment in Byzantine-Bulgarian relations. The empire, still recovering from earlier setbacks against the Bulgars, faced a ruler determined to reassert authority and restore the prestige of Constantinople. Nikephoros was an ambitious leader, energetic and resolute. He understood that Byzantium's credibility rested on its ability to enforce dominance in the Balkans. The humiliation of prior defeats, particularly during Krum's ascendancy, weighed heavily on the imperial court. Nikephoros resolved to launch a campaign that would decisively crush the Bulgarian threat and reaffirm imperial supremacy. The Bulgarian state under Krum had demonstrated remarkable resilience. The empire had learned that diplomacy, tribute, and minor military engagements were insufficient to contain the Bulgars. By the time Nikephoros assembled his forces, the Bulgarians were entrenched, disciplined, and experienced in both defense and offensive strategy. Krum had established a network of fortifications, loyal contingents, and alliances with Slavic communities. The Bulgars' familiarity with local geography allowed them to anticipate Byzantine movements and prepare effective countermeasures. Nikephoros, confident in the size and organization of his army, believed that a decisive march into the heart of Bulgaria could end the threat once and for all. He mobilized forces that included elite troops, seasoned generals, and substantial logistical support. Supplies were gathered, alliances reinforced, and detailed plans made to secure victory. The emperor expected that the imperial army's discipline and training would overcome the Bulgarian defenses, and that Krum's forces would either flee or be decisively destroyed. The campaign began with initial success. Byzantine forces moved southward into Bulgarian territory, encountering minor resistance as scouts reported the location of enemy troops and positions. The emperor believed that the Bulgars could be lured into open battle, where the superiority of Byzantine formations would ensure victory. However, the Bulgarians had anticipated such tactics. Krum's leadership ensured that his forces remained disciplined, used terrain to their advantage, and prepared ambushes in key areas. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of both states and alter the course of their rivalry. The battle near Pliska, the Bulgarian capital, became one of the most catastrophic defeats in Byzantine history. Nikephoros marched into the region confident of success, unaware that the Bulgars had established a trap. Narrow passes, marshes, and the natural obstacles of the Balkan terrain limited the effectiveness of the imperial army. The Bulgars struck swiftly, encircling the Byzantines and cutting off their retreat. The imperial forces, though large and well-trained, were unprepared for the combination of tactical cunning and disciplined aggression they encountered. Panic spread through the ranks as units became disorganized, commanders were killed or captured, and soldiers found themselves surrounded. The outcome was devastating. Nikephoros himself perished in the battle, along with many of his generals and thousands of soldiers. The scale of the defeat sent shockwaves throughout the Byzantine Empire. It was not merely a military loss, it was a psychological catastrophe. The empire had prided itself on centuries of endurance, on the claim to be the rightful continuation of Rome, and on the ability to enforce its authority. The disaster at Pliska shattered these assumptions. Constantinople was forced to confront the reality that its northern frontier could not be dominated through force alone, and that the Bulgars had become a peer rival capable of inflicting unparalleled damage. The consequences of the battle extended far beyond the immediate loss of troops. The Byzantine treasury was strained by the need to replace fallen soldiers and recover lost equipment. Administrative structures in the Balkans were disrupted, creating instability in regions previously under imperial control. Tribes and local populations, long dependent on Byzantine authority, reconsidered their allegiances. Some saw the Bulgars as the emerging power and shifted loyalty accordingly. The empire's prestige suffered irreparable damage, affecting both internal morale and external perception. Allies across the region began to view Byzantium with caution, recognizing that its military power was not absolute. Chroniclers of the era recorded the disaster with a mixture of horror and awe. The magnitude of the defeat became legendary, inspiring both fear and respect. Byzantine historians wrote of the emperor's bravery, but lamented the consequences of overconfidence and miscalculation. Bulgarian chroniclers celebrated the victory as proof of the state's growing strength, skill, and legitimacy. Pliska became a symbol of Bulgarian ascendancy and the vulnerability of even the most powerful imperial forces. In response to the defeat, the empire had to reassess its strategies. Military reforms became necessary, including changes in training, command structures, and frontier defense. Emperors who followed Nikephoros were haunted by the memory of Pliska, aware that Bulgarian power could not be underestimated. Diplomatic efforts increased in intensity, combining tribute, alliances, and careful negotiations to avoid further disasters. Religion also played a role, as the empire sought to use spiritual influence to stabilize regions and encourage loyalty among populations living near Bulgarian territory. For Bulgaria, the victory reinforced confidence and solidified internal cohesion. Krum had demonstrated that careful planning, discipline, and strategic audacity could overcome even the largest imperial armies. The triumph at Pliska allowed Bulgaria to expand influence and reinforce the legitimacy of its ruling elite. It also provided a narrative of victory that would endure for generations, emphasizing the capability of the state to defend its interests and assert dominance when necessary. The psychological impact of Pliska shaped Byzantine-Bulgarian relations for decades. Future emperors approached Bulgaria with a mixture of caution, respect, and anxiety. The empire understood that underestimating the Bulgars could lead to catastrophe. Bulgarian rulers, in turn, interpreted the defeat as evidence that strategic patience, preparation, and intelligence were decisive factors in determining outcomes. The lessons of the battle informed military doctrine, political negotiations, and the broader perception of power in Eastern Europe. The disaster at Pliska also set the stage for a prolonged rivalry that would endure for generations. Byzantium remained a powerful empire with resources, administrative sophistication, and cultural prestige. Bulgaria had proven its capacity to resist, to defeat, and to exploit weaknesses. Neither side could claim absolute dominance. Instead, the two states entered a pattern of alternating victories and defeats, of treaties and broken promises, of diplomacy intertwined with military confrontation. The memory of Pliska ensured that both sides acted with caution and strategic foresight in subsequent encounters. This period illustrates the fragile balance of medieval power. A single battle could reshape perceptions, alter political structures, and redefine relationships between states. For Byzantium, the loss emphasized vulnerability, the limits of force, and the need for careful planning. For Bulgaria, the triumph confirmed the potential for ascendancy, the importance of leadership, and the value of strategic discipline. The events surrounding Pliska would echo through centuries, forming the foundation of historical memory and identity for both nations. In the end, the disaster at Pliska was more than a defeat. It was a turning point that redefined the rivalry between Byzantium and Bulgaria. The empire learned that authority could not be assumed, that treaties required negotiation, and that military superiority was never guaranteed. Bulgaria learned that careful leadership, knowledge of the terrain, and unity of purpose could elevate a state from survival to dominance. The clash between Emperor Nikephoros and Krum became emblematic of the challenges, risks, and possibilities that defined medieval Eastern Europe. It was a moment in which the balance of power shifted, in which confidence and fear intertwined, and in which the stakes of this enduring conflict became unmistakably clear. The struggle for survival, Byzantium's internal turmoil. The catastrophic defeat at Pliska did not merely weaken the Byzantine army. It exposed fractures within the empire that had long existed, but had been masked by the illusion of imperial invincibility. In the decades following the disaster, Byzantium struggled not only against external threats, but against the weight of its own internal instability. Regencies, coups, and rebellions became the recurrent patterns that both weakened the empire and provided opportunities for Bulgaria to consolidate power and extend influence. The Bulgars, having demonstrated their military capabilities under Krum, became masters of exploiting Byzantine vulnerabilities, understanding that the empire's true fragility lay not only in its borders, but in its court. The succession crises that followed Nikephoros' death underscored the instability. The emperor had been killed in battle, leaving no clear and uncontested heir. His successors faced the dual challenge of consolidating authority at home while preparing defenses against a resurgent Bulgarian threat. Often these heirs were young, inexperienced, or contested by ambitious nobles and military leaders. In some instances, regencies were formed to govern in the name of child emperors. While these arrangements were intended to stabilize the empire, they frequently resulted in factionalism, competing councils, and rivalries that paralyzed decision-making. The Bulgars were quick to recognize these weaknesses and adjusted their strategies accordingly. Coups and insurrections were not uncommon. Ambitious generals and provincial governors sought to seize the throne, exploiting the empire's distraction with external threats. Each coup disrupted administration, diverted resources, and weakened military cohesion. For the Bulgars, this internal chaos was an opportunity to press forward along the northern frontier, raid borderlands, and assert influence in contested regions. Bulgarian leaders often timed campaigns to coincide with moments of Byzantine weakness, striking when the empire's attention was consumed by internal power struggles rather than defense. Rebellions in the provinces compounded the problem. Populations living along the Danube and in Thrace had endured decades of conflict and shifting allegiances. Some communities resisted imperial authority, seeking autonomy or aligning with the Bulgars in hopes of protection and stability. Others were embittered by heavy taxation, forced conscription, or the failure of Constantinople to secure their lands from raiding parties. These rebellions forced the empire to divide its attention, sending troops to suppress insurrections while simultaneously responding to the threat of Bulgarian incursions. The cumulative effect of internal unrest made coordinated military responses increasingly difficult. Strategic weaknesses that had existed for decades became increasingly apparent. The Byzantine army, though disciplined and experienced, relied on rapid mobilization of provincial forces. When local governors were embroiled in political disputes or hesitant to deploy troops against the Bulgars, the empire's capacity for defense was severely diminished. Fortresses in key regions were sometimes undermanned, garrisons underpaid, and supply lines vulnerable. Bulgarian commanders, aware of these conditions, exploited gaps in defense, conducting raids and campaigns with precision timing to maximize impact. They avoided costly sieges whenever possible, instead striking at the empire's soft underbelly. Economic pressures added another layer of difficulty. The loss of resources from border provinces, coupled with the expense of rebuilding armies and fortifications, strained the treasury. Byzantium had once relied on its wealth to maintain control through bribes, tribute, and incentives. Following repeated defeats and internal turmoil, financial reserves were depleted, and the ability to influence local populations diminished. Bulgarian leaders seized the opportunity to expand trade influence, secure tribute from vulnerable communities, and establish economic footholds in regions previously dominated by Byzantium. Religious and cultural pressures also played a subtle but important role. The empire had long used the authority of the Orthodox Church to enforce loyalty and influence subject populations. In regions under Bulgar threat, however, the reach of Constantinople's spiritual influence was limited. The Bulgars maintained traditional practices alongside selective adoption of Christianity, creating a distinct cultural identity. Byzantine attempts to use religion as a tool of governance met resistance, further highlighting the empire's weakened grip on its frontier regions. The combined effect of regencies, coups, rebellions, and strategic weaknesses created a cycle that was difficult to break. Every internal crisis provided the Bulgars with opportunities to advance, and every Bulgarian incursion further destabilized imperial authority. Successive emperors learned that survival required delicate balancing. They had to maintain enough military presence to deter attacks, while simultaneously navigating treacherous court politics and managing provincial unrest. Failure in either arena could invite disaster, as Pliska had demonstrated. Despite these challenges, Byzantium did not collapse. The empire retained significant administrative structures, urban centers, and economic resources. Constantinople itself remained a bastion of culture, wealth, and authority, even as its influence in the north was challenged. The ability of the Byzantine state to endure internal turmoil while confronting a powerful rival reflected centuries of institutional resilience. Nevertheless, the constant pressure from Bulgaria ensured that the empire's survival was a continual struggle rather than a stable condition. For the Bulgars, Byzantine internal weakness confirmed the value of patience and strategic timing. Rather than seeking to destroy the empire outright, Bulgarian leaders focused on consolidating power, expanding influence, and exploiting moments of opportunity. Raids, diplomatic maneuvers, and tactical engagements were carefully calibrated to maximize advantage while minimizing unnecessary losses. The long-term vision was clear. The empire's instability could be leveraged to ensure Bulgarian security and extend political control across contested regions. The historical record demonstrates how effectively the Bulgars adapted to the complex political environment. Chroniclers note repeated campaigns timed to coincide with Byzantine succession disputes. Treaties were negotiated and then broken when the empire was distracted. Leaders such as Krum and his successors understood that the ultimate test of power was not only military might, but the ability to manipulate the shifting conditions of a rival state. Byzantium's internal turmoil became a central factor in the enduring rivalry, shaping the strategies, decisions, and outcomes of the next 2 centuries. Byzantine rulers faced the constant tension between immediate survival and long-term strategy. They sought to rebuild armies, reinforce fortifications, and suppress rebellions, while simultaneously attempting to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of their subjects and allies. Each new emperor inherited both the external threat of Bulgaria and the internal challenges of succession, factionalism, and economic strain. This combination of pressures ensured that every military campaign was undertaken under conditions of uncertainty, with the ever-present risk of disaster. The pattern established during this period had lasting consequences. Bulgarian victories were amplified by Byzantine mismanagement, while imperial attempts at stabilization often failed to produce enduring results. The empire's internal problems delayed decisive responses to Bulgarian expansion and made negotiation, bribery, and diplomacy necessary tools alongside military action. The memory of Pliska and subsequent Bulgarian campaigns ensured that emperors approached every decision with caution, aware that internal failure could be as fatal as defeat in battle. The struggle for survival during these decades shaped both empires. Byzantium learned to value intelligence, flexibility, and the careful management of internal politics. Bulgaria gained experience in strategic opportunism, territorial consolidation, and the use of diplomacy alongside military action. The relationship between the 2 states evolved into one defined by a mixture of confrontation, negotiation, and calculated restraint. Each victory, loss, or internal crisis influenced the broader trajectory of the rivalry, creating a complex interplay of power, opportunity, and strategic foresight. Ultimately, Byzantium's internal turmoil ensured that the conflict with Bulgaria was never straightforward. The empire's succession crises, coups, and rebellions were not simply distractions. They were integral to the unfolding narrative of the rivalry. The Bulgars demonstrated that a rising power could thrive not only by winning battles, but by exploiting the vulnerabilities of an established empire. The lessons learned during this period would echo through decades of confrontation, shaping the political, military and cultural landscape of Eastern Europe. The decades following Pliska illustrate the precarious nature of medieval empires. Strength could be undone by mismanagement, ambition or internal division. Conversely, opportunity could be seized by those who understood timing, leadership and strategy. Byzantium's internal struggles, combined with Bulgaria's growing sophistication, ensured that the two-century-long rivalry would be marked by alternating triumphs, setbacks and enduring tension. The reign of Omurtag and the long, bitter stalemate. The reign of Omurtag marked a period in which Bulgaria and Byzantium settled into a long and bitter stalemate. Following the tumultuous decades of battles, defeats, and catastrophic encounters such as the disaster at Pliska, both powers recognized the limits of aggression. Omurtag, who ascended to the Bulgarian throne after Krum and his immediate successors, understood that survival and stability required a different strategy. His reign was not defined by dramatic victories or catastrophic defeats, but by calculated measures designed to preserve power, consolidate territory, and navigate the dangerous landscape of Byzantine rivalry. Omurtag's approach was pragmatic and relentless. He strengthened fortifications along the empire's borders, particularly in Thrace and along the Danube. These defenses were not merely symbolic. They reflected a clear understanding of the challenges posed by Byzantine military campaigns and the persistent instability in frontier regions. Towers, walls, and fortified settlements were expanded and reinforced. The Bulgarian military was organized in a manner that allowed rapid response to incursions while maintaining the integrity of the state. Soldiers were trained, provisions stockpiled, and communication lines established to ensure that no enemy force could surprise or overwhelm the Bulgarian heartland. Diplomacy became a central component of Omurtag's policy. He recognized that direct confrontation with the Byzantines was costly and uncertain. Instead, he pursued agreements and treaties designed to establish boundaries, regulate tribute, and create a framework of coexistence that benefited Bulgaria. These arrangements were often tense and fragile, reflecting the enduring mistrust between the two powers. Negotiations required careful attention to timing, phrasing, and enforcement, as any perceived weakness could be exploited by the Byzantines, and any overreach could provoke renewed conflict. Omurtag's diplomatic skill ensured that Bulgaria retained significant advantages, even while appearing to compromise. The result of this combination of fortifications and diplomacy was a stalemate that endured for decades. The Bulgars controlled their territories effectively, and the Byzantines recognized the difficulty of launching campaigns that could decisively alter the balance of power. Raids and skirmishes continued, but major battles became rare. Both sides learned that attrition, miscalculation, or the sudden loss of a key leader could dramatically alter outcomes. The cautious equilibrium established by Omurtag allowed Bulgaria to consolidate resources, strengthen administration, and integrate Slavic populations more deeply into the state. Cultural separation became a defining feature of this period. The Bulgars, although influenced by Byzantine civilization in some respects, maintained a distinct identity. Language, customs, and governance reinforced a sense of independence. The Byzantines, for their part, cultivated their own traditions, legal codes, and religious authority, often attempting to assert influence through churches and monasteries. Yet the separation remained pronounced. Borders were not only political and military, but also cultural. Communities in contested regions often navigated both worlds, blending practices for survival while maintaining distinct allegiances. Omurtag's reign demonstrated the strategic value of patience. Unlike the aggressive campaigns of Krum or the catastrophic ambitions of Nikephoros, Omurtag focused on building resilience. The Bulgarian state became capable of withstanding external pressure without engaging in constant large-scale warfare. The Bulgars refined administrative practices, ensuring that tax collection, military organization, and territorial governance functioned effectively even in the absence of conquest. This period of stability provided a foundation that would influence Bulgaria's position in the Balkans for generations. The Byzantines, meanwhile, were forced to adapt. Repeated failures and the recognition of Bulgarian strength tempered imperial ambitions in the north. Military campaigns required careful planning, substantial resources, and precise timing to avoid disaster. Diplomatic engagement became more prominent as emperors sought to maintain influence without risking another catastrophic defeat. The balance of power was clear. Neither side could easily dominate the other, and the cost of miscalculation was severe. Despite the stalemate, occasional tensions flared into violence. Border disputes, raids, and localized skirmishes reminded both powers of the fragility of peace. Omurtag's strategies, however, minimized the risk of major setbacks. He avoided reckless campaigns, relied on intelligence and reconnaissance, and ensured that Bulgarian forces were always prepared to respond. The careful calibration of military and diplomatic action allowed the state to maintain authority while avoiding the high human and material cost of open war. Economically, the stalemate allowed Bulgaria to stabilize and develop internal infrastructure. Trade routes were secured, agricultural production protected, and towns fortified. Resources previously devoted to constant campaigning could be redirected toward consolidating internal power. Tribute agreements and controlled exchanges with Byzantium provided additional revenue while maintaining the appearance of diplomacy and mutual respect. This period of relative calm enabled Bulgaria to mature politically and socially, preparing the state for the challenges that would emerge in later decades. Religious and cultural developments during Omurtag's reign also reinforced Bulgarian identity. While some Byzantine influence persisted, the Bulgars strengthened their own institutions, often blending existing pagan traditions with selective Christian practices. This approach allowed the state to integrate diverse populations while maintaining distinct political and cultural cohesion. Religion became a tool not only of governance, but of identity formation, helping to unify the state internally, even as it coexisted with the Byzantines externally. The long, bitter stalemate produced a clear lesson for both powers. Military superiority alone could not determine outcomes. Leadership, planning, and strategic patience were equally essential. Omurtag's reign demonstrated that stability could be achieved not through conquest alone, but through careful management of resources, fortifications, diplomacy, and internal cohesion. The Bulgars learned that enduring power depended on preparation and flexibility, not merely the ability to win a single battle. For Byzantium, the stalemate was a source of frustration and reflection. The empire had faced disasters such as Pliska and endured the internal turmoil that followed. Its northern frontier was secure only in a fragile sense, dependent on diplomacy and cautious engagement rather than domination. The long period of stalemate forced imperial leaders to reconsider their assumptions about power, strategy, and the limits of authority. They recognized that the Bulgars were no longer a peripheral threat, but a sophisticated state capable of defending itself and negotiating from strength. This period also shaped the expectations of future generations. Both Bulgarian and Byzantine chroniclers recorded the stalemate with careful attention to detail, emphasizing the lessons learned from patience, preparation, and strategic foresight. The narratives conveyed the challenges of sustaining power in a complex and contested landscape. They highlighted the importance of leadership, the interplay between military strength and diplomacy, and the consequences of misjudging an opponent. Omurtag's reign, while not marked by dramatic battles or extraordinary victories, stands as a testament to the power of disciplined governance and strategic calculation. The Bulgars demonstrated that endurance and preparation could rival aggression and ambition. The Byzantines, constrained by the limits of their northern campaigns, learned that recognition of a rival's strength was essential for survival. The stalemate established during these decades would shape the political, military and cultural trajectory of the Balkans, setting the stage for the next phase of confrontation in the centuries-long struggle between Bulgaria and Byzantium. By the end of Omurtag's reign, Bulgaria had solidified its borders, strengthened its internal structures, and projected authority in a manner that ensured continued resilience. The empire had learned to respect Bulgarian power while seeking opportunities to regain influence through careful diplomacy, selective campaigns, and strategic patience. This long, bitter stalemate, though devoid of dramatic conquests, was a defining period in the history of the rivalry, highlighting the interplay of endurance, preparation, and the delicate balance of power that would continue to shape Eastern Europe for generations. Boris I and the conversion of Bulgaria. The reign of Boris I marked one of the most transformative periods in the history of Bulgaria. By the early 9th century, the Bulgarian state had matured into a formidable power in the Balkans. Yet, despite its military strength and administrative organization, the empire faced a new challenge: how to consolidate internal unity, integrate diverse populations, and strengthen legitimacy. Boris recognized that religion, long a source of identity and cohesion in neighboring empires, could serve as a unifying force for Bulgaria. The Christianization of Bulgaria would become a central feature of his reign, transforming society and creating new dimensions in the enduring rivalry with Byzantium. Bulgaria at the time was a complex and multi-ethnic state. The ruling Bulgar elite, descended from steppe warriors, coexisted with Slavic populations that had settled across the region. These groups had distinct languages, customs, and traditions. Maintaining cohesion required more than military dominance. It required a shared system of beliefs and symbols capable of bridging cultural divides. Boris understood that adopting Christianity could provide a framework of unity, linking the disparate populations of his empire under a single spiritual and cultural identity. The conversion to Christianity was not straightforward. Bulgaria had long practiced traditional Bulgar religious customs, and Slavic communities maintained their own ritual practices. For many, the adoption of a foreign religion represented a profound change, requiring negotiation, persuasion, and occasionally coercion. Boris approached this challenge with careful planning. He sought to balance respect for existing traditions with the imposition of a new faith that could serve as the foundation of Bulgarian identity. This delicate balancing act would define the trajectory of his reign. Religion also became a geopolitical battleground. The question of whether Bulgaria would align with Rome or Constantinople was of paramount importance. The Byzantine Empire, with its centuries of experience in using religion as a tool of governance, sought to assert influence over Bulgaria. The empire hoped that by establishing the Bulgarian Church under Constantinople's authority, it could extend spiritual and political control. At the same time, the papacy in Rome presented an alternative, offering recognition, legitimacy, and potential alliances. Boris navigated this competition with remarkable skill, recognizing that the outcome would shape Bulgaria's political and cultural orientation for generations. The formal conversion of Bulgaria involved both personal commitment and state policy. Boris himself was baptized, taking the Christian name Michael. This act signaled to the nobility and populace alike that the empire was entering a new era. Churches were established, clerical hierarchies organized, and liturgical practices introduced. Byzantine clergy played a significant role, providing expertise, training, and models for governance. At the same time, Boris ensured that Bulgaria retained control over ecclesiastical appointments and administration, preserving political autonomy even while embracing the new faith. The adoption of Christianity had profound social and cultural implications. Literacy and education began to spread, often through monastic centers and church schools. The creation of a written Bulgarian language and the translation of liturgical texts reinforced both religious and national identity. Christianity became a vehicle for centralized authority, providing a common set of values and practices that could unify the empire. It also offered a framework through which Bulgarian rulers could negotiate with neighboring powers on equal footing, using shared religious vocabulary and structures to support diplomacy and alliances. The struggle between Rome and Constantinople over Bulgarian allegiance reflected broader patterns in the region. Byzantium sought to maintain influence over its northern neighbor, using shared liturgy, clergy, and rituals to assert soft power. Rome, in contrast, offered recognition and legitimacy independent of Byzantine authority. Boris skillfully played these powers against each other, accepting certain concessions while preserving autonomy. By navigating this contest, he strengthened Bulgaria's position as an independent actor and ensured that conversion did not translate into subordination. The Christianization of Bulgaria also had strategic military consequences. Shared religious identity allowed for more cohesive mobilization of forces and greater loyalty among troops drawn from diverse ethnic groups. It enhanced internal stability, reducing the risk of rebellion or defection along the northern and western borders. The alignment with Christianity, while politically complex, reinforced the cohesion of the state and its capacity to resist both Byzantine influence and external threats. For Byzantium, Bulgaria's conversion was both a challenge and an opportunity. The empire viewed the process through the lens of power politics, understanding that religious alignment could shift regional balances. While some emperors hoped that Bulgaria would remain within the Byzantine sphere of influence, the reality of political pragmatism often meant that the empire had to accept Bulgarian autonomy. This tension between spiritual authority and political control would shape interactions between the two states for centuries, adding a new dimension to the long-standing rivalry. The cultural impact of Boris's reforms was profound. Monasteries, churches, and schools became centers of learning, literacy, and artistic production. Iconography, architectural styles, and ecclesiastical structures reflected a blend of Byzantine influence and local tradition. This synthesis created a distinctly Bulgarian form of Christianity, one that reinforced national identity while connecting the empire to broader Christian civilization. It also provided a durable framework for governance, moral authority, and social cohesion. Boris's success in managing the conversion process required political acumen. He had to balance the interests of the Bulgar nobility, the Slavic majority, and competing foreign powers. He faced internal resistance from those who feared the loss of traditional customs and external pressure from Byzantium seeking influence. By carefully sequencing reforms, consolidating authority, and engaging in diplomacy, Boris created a stable religious foundation that would endure beyond his reign. The legacy of Christianization extended far beyond immediate political and cultural effects. It shaped the identity of Bulgaria, defining its role in the Balkans and its relationship with Byzantium and the broader Christian world. The empire's adoption of Christianity allowed it to participate in the diplomatic, cultural and religious networks of medieval Europe on equal terms. It reinforced sovereignty, enhanced legitimacy, and provided tools for internal governance and societal cohesion. This transformation did not eliminate conflict with Byzantium. The northern frontier remained contested, and the struggle for influence over border regions persisted. However, the adoption of Christianity added a new dimension to the rivalry, one that was less about sheer military conquest and more about ideological, cultural and religious authority. Bulgaria now possessed not only armies and fortifications, but also a unifying religion that could strengthen loyalty, integrate populations, and provide legitimacy in negotiations with powerful neighbors. The reign of Boris I thus represents a turning point in the long conflict between Byzantium and Bulgaria. While battles and political maneuvering continued, the introduction of Christianity fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. Religion became a tool of statecraft, a source of identity, and a means of consolidating power. Boris's careful management of conversion, the delicate balancing between Rome and Constantinople, and the internal integration of diverse populations ensured that Bulgaria emerged as a resilient and cohesive state, capable of withstanding both internal divisions and external pressures. By the end of Boris's reign, Bulgaria had transitioned from a pagan warrior state to a Christian empire with cultural sophistication, political cohesion, and enduring legitimacy. This transformation shifted the dynamics of the Byzantine-Bulgarian rivalry, creating a framework in which diplomacy, religion, and cultural influence would be as critical as military campaigns. The adoption of Christianity provided Bulgaria with tools for governance, identity, and strategic engagement that would shape the empire's trajectory for generations, influencing the balance of power in the Balkans and redefining the relationship with Byzantium. Byzantine revival efforts. The Macedonian dynasty emerges. After decades of setbacks, internal turmoil, and the long, bitter stalemate with Bulgaria, Byzantium faced the urgent necessity of revival. The empire had endured catastrophic defeats, border instability, and repeated internal crises that weakened its credibility both at home and abroad. Amid this period of uncertainty, a new dynasty emerged in Constantinople, determined to restore the empire's fortunes. The Macedonian dynasty, beginning with Basil I, represented a turning point in Byzantine history, one characterized by military reform, legal restructuring, and the creation of a renewed imperial identity. Basil I came to power in an empire haunted by failure and insecurity. He was not of noble birth, rising from relatively humble origins, yet his vision was ambitious. He understood that Byzantium's survival and future prosperity depended on revitalizing its military, consolidating administrative authority, and restoring faith in imperial governance. His ascent signaled the beginning of an era in which the empire would seek to stabilize its borders, redefine its internal structures, and reclaim the prestige that had been eroded by repeated conflict with Bulgaria and internal instability. Military reforms were central to this revival. The Byzantine army had suffered from a combination of defeats, poor discipline, and outdated organization. Basil recognized that a professional, disciplined force was essential not only to defend the empire, but to project power. Training programs were standardized, command structures clarified, and frontier garrisons reinforced. New units were organized to respond rapidly to raids along the northern borders, particularly in Thrace and the regions adjacent to Bulgarian-controlled territory. By reorganizing the army, the emperor aimed to prevent disasters like Pliska and to ensure that Byzantine forces could engage the Bulgars on terms more favorable to the empire. In addition to military restructuring, the Macedonian emperors undertook comprehensive legal reforms. The empire's law codes had become cumbersome, inconsistent, and difficult to enforce across distant provinces. Basil and his successors sought to codify and clarify laws, providing a consistent framework for administration and justice. This legal consolidation strengthened central authority, allowing governors and officials to act with confidence and consistency. It also reinforced the empire's capacity to manage resources, enforce taxation, and maintain loyalty among provincial populations. By establishing legal clarity, the dynasty aimed to reduce internal unrest and create conditions conducive to long-term stability. The revival under the Macedonian dynasty extended beyond military and legal measures. A new imperial identity emerged, one rooted in the continuity of Rome, the authority of Constantinople, and the cultural and religious traditions of Byzantium. Ceremonial reforms emphasized the emperor's role as both political and spiritual leader. Public rituals, state ceremonies, and court protocol reinforced loyalty, inspired respect, and cultivated a sense of unity within the empire. This symbolic dimension of power was as significant as military and legal reforms, providing a framework through which Byzantium could project authority even in regions where its physical control was contested. Diplomacy also played a critical role in this period of revival. The Macedonian emperors engaged in negotiations with neighboring states, including Bulgaria, the Slavic principalities, and other regional powers. The aim was to secure borders, stabilize trade routes, and establish temporary truces that would allow the empire to consolidate internally. These agreements were pragmatic, reflecting the limitations of military capability and the recognition of Bulgaria's continued strength. Yet they were also strategic, creating opportunities to reinforce Byzantine influence without engaging in unnecessary or risky campaigns. The Bulgars, for their part, observed these revival efforts with keen awareness. The empire's reorganization posed a potential threat, signaling that Byzantium might once again project power along the northern frontier. Bulgarian leaders responded cautiously, balancing the desire to exploit internal Byzantine weaknesses with the recognition that the empire under the Macedonian dynasty was more capable than previous administrations. The period of stalemate established under Omurtag continued, but now the dynamic was more complex. Byzantium was no longer simply reactive. It had regained some capacity to assert influence, challenge Bulgarian operations, and defend its territories more effectively. Economic reforms complemented military and administrative changes. Trade networks were revitalized, particularly in key urban centers such as Constantinople, Thessalonica, and Adrianople. The empire sought to secure routes that had been vulnerable to raids and to restore confidence among merchants and artisans. Financial stability was reinforced through improved taxation systems, careful management of resources, and strategic investment in fortifications and military logistics. These economic measures were essential to supporting the broader revival, ensuring that the empire could sustain its armies, defend its borders, and maintain the administrative apparatus required for effective governance. Religious policy remained central to Byzantine identity during this period. The Macedonian emperors emphasized the authority of the Orthodox Church as a unifying force. Monasteries, churches, and ecclesiastical councils were used to reinforce loyalty, promote education, and cultivate cultural cohesion. Religion became a tool not only for spiritual life, but for political stability, offering a framework through which citizens could understand the legitimacy of imperial authority. The integration of church and state strengthened internal cohesion, providing Byzantium with moral authority alongside military and administrative power. The revival under the Macedonian dynasty also had significant cultural implications. Art, literature, and architecture flourished, reflecting a renewed confidence in the empire's capabilities. Court-sponsored programs encouraged scholarship, the copying of classical texts, and the production of monumental works. Cultural vibrancy reinforced political legitimacy, demonstrating to both internal and external audiences that Byzantium remained a sophisticated and enduring civilization. This intellectual and artistic revival complemented military and administrative efforts, creating a multidimensional approach to restoring imperial prestige. One of the most important aspects of this revival was its long-term impact on the Byzantine-Bulgarian rivalry. The Macedonian dynasty's reforms increased the empire's capacity to resist Bulgarian expansion, fortify strategic positions, and engage diplomatically on more favorable terms. While the two powers remained rivals, the balance shifted subtly. Bulgaria continued to assert influence, but Byzantium now possessed renewed resilience, improved administrative structures, and a capacity for sustained engagement that had been absent in previous decades. The revival did not end conflict, but it transformed the parameters in which that conflict was conducted. Historians emphasize that the Macedonian dynasty's emergence was as much about perception as it was about tangible change. The demonstration of competence, order, and authority reassured provincial populations, deterred opportunistic enemies, and signaled to the Bulgars that Byzantium had regained a measure of strength. The careful combination of military readiness, legal reform, economic management, and cultural consolidation created a state capable of projecting power across multiple domains. The empire, battered by past defeats and internal turmoil, was asserting itself once more as a formidable actor in the Balkans and beyond. In essence, the rise of the Macedonian dynasty represents a turning point in Byzantine history. The empire had learned from decades of failure, observing the consequences of miscalculation, internal weakness, and underestimating rivals. Military, legal, economic, and cultural reforms were integrated to create a coherent strategy for survival and revival. The renewed imperial identity reinforced authority, cultivated loyalty, and provided a framework through which Byzantium could navigate the enduring rivalry with Bulgaria while consolidating power internally. By the end of this phase, Byzantium had regained a measure of stability and capability that allowed it to confront the Bulgars on more equal terms. While the northern frontier remained contested and the threat of conflict persisted, the empire had transformed itself from a reactive, weakened state into a power capable of measured response and strategic initiative. The Macedonian dynasty's revival set the stage for subsequent confrontations, shaping the political and military landscape of Eastern Europe and demonstrating that even after decades of disaster, Byzantium could recover, adapt, and endure. Simeon the Great, the Bulgarian Caesar. The reign of Simeon I, later remembered as Simeon the Great, marked the zenith of Bulgarian power and ambition. Born into a state already transformed by the Christianization of his father, Boris I, Simeon inherited a kingdom that was politically cohesive, culturally sophisticated, and militarily capable. From the moment he ascended the throne, his vision was grand. He did not seek merely to defend Bulgaria or consolidate existing territories. He aspired to something far greater, to replace Byzantium as the legitimate heir to the Roman legacy in the Eastern Balkans. Simeon's ambition would shape the region, provoke massive conflicts, and redefine the relationship between Bulgaria and Byzantium for decades. Simeon's claim was audacious. Byzantium, with its centuries of imperial authority, magnificent capital, and enduring institutions, remained a formidable adversary. Yet Simeon viewed the empire as vulnerable. He had witnessed the limits of Byzantine power during the long stalemates of his predecessors. He understood that military campaigns, when combined with strategic diplomacy, could yield extraordinary results. Unlike previous Bulgarian rulers, Simeon sought not merely raiding or tribute, but dominance, control over key cities, recognition of imperial status, and the projection of Bulgarian authority across the Balkans. The Bulgarian military, now well-trained, disciplined and centralized, became the instrument of Simeon's ambitions. He reorganized his forces to conduct sustained campaigns, integrating cavalry, infantry, and riverine operations to ensure maximum flexibility. Under his leadership, Bulgarian armies could march deep into Byzantine territory, besiege fortified cities, and exploit the weaknesses of imperial command structures. The empire's northern and western frontiers remained secure, allowing Simeon to concentrate on the strategic objective of challenging Constantinople's supremacy. Simeon's campaigns were vast in scale and audacious in scope. Battles erupted across Thrace, Macedonia, and the Aegean periphery, with Bulgarian forces achieving victories that forced Byzantium into defensive positions. One of the most significant confrontations occurred at the Battle of Achelous, where Simeon's army inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Byzantine forces. The emperor was forced to flee, and Bulgarian forces advanced with unprecedented confidence. These victories were not isolated incidents. They represented the culmination of decades of military preparation, internal stability, and strategic foresight initiated by previous rulers. Sieges became a defining feature of Simeon's strategy. Fortified cities such as Adrianople, Thessalonica, and other key urban centers faced repeated Bulgarian pressure. These sieges demonstrated both military sophistication and psychological warfare. Bulgarian forces sought not only to capture territory, but to undermine Byzantine morale and project an image of inevitability. Simeon understood that control of cities, recognition of authority by local populations, and the display of military prowess were as important as territorial expansion. Success in one campaign often created ripple effects across the region, influencing alliances, tribute arrangements, and the calculation of rivals. Shifting alliances played a central role in Simeon's strategy. He skillfully navigated the complex web of Balkan politics, forging temporary agreements with neighboring Slavic princes, the Serbs, and various Byzantine factions. These alliances were often tactical, designed to isolate Byzantium or to create multiple fronts that stretched imperial resources. Simeon's diplomatic acumen complemented his military strategy, demonstrating that he was not only a battlefield commander, but a master of political maneuvering. Every engagement was calculated, every treaty temporary and instrumental, serving the overarching goal of asserting Bulgaria's supremacy in the region. The symbolic dimension of Simeon's ambition cannot be overstated. He sought recognition as Tsar, a title equivalent to Caesar, signaling his aspiration to inherit the mantle of Rome. This declaration was provocative, challenging the ideological foundation of Byzantium itself. Constantinople, long accustomed to its claim as the sole Roman successor, faced a rival asserting not only military might, but also cultural and spiritual legitimacy. Simeon commissioned inscriptions, monumental architecture, and ceremonial displays to reinforce this identity, linking his authority to the Roman and Christian traditions revered across the empire. Religion played a strategic role in Simeon's assertion of legitimacy. By consolidating the Bulgarian Orthodox Church and maintaining its independence from Constantinople, he created an ecclesiastical structure capable of endorsing and sustaining his imperial claims. The church served as a tool for internal cohesion and as a statement to external powers. Simeon's alignment of political and religious authority reinforced his image as a ruler on par with the Byzantine emperor, one capable of assuming the mantle of Rome itself. Economics supported military and political ambitions. Bulgaria's control of fertile lands, trade routes, and tribute-paying regions ensured a steady flow of resources necessary to sustain large-scale campaigns. taxation and administration, refined under Boris I and further developed by Simeon, enabled the mobilization of armies and maintenance of fortifications. The empire's economic base allowed Simeon to conduct prolonged sieges, fund diplomatic missions, and reward loyal nobles, reinforcing the integration of diverse regions under central authority. Despite his successes, Simeon faced formidable challenges. Byzantium was resilient, adapting to setbacks, reorganizing forces, and attempting to forge alliances that could counterbalance Bulgarian expansion. Rebellions in newly conquered territories and resistance from local elites required continuous attention. Simeon's vision, while grand, demanded constant vigilance. Every victory had to be reinforced through administration, diplomacy, and strategic positioning. Failure in any of these domains could unravel the gains of years of campaigning. The historiography of Simeon's reign emphasizes both ambition and audacity. Chroniclers record the scale of his armies, the intensity of sieges, and the breadth of his campaigns. They highlight the psychological impact on Byzantium, where fear of Bulgarian dominance permeated court politics and military planning. Simeon's pursuit of the title of Tsar, his strategic use of religion, and his relentless campaigns created a new paradigm in Balkan politics. The legacy of these decades would influence not only subsequent Bulgarian rulers, but also the approach of Byzantium in defending its authority and engaging with emerging regional powers. Simeon's diplomacy was often as important as his military endeavors. By negotiating temporary truces, marriages, and alliances, he managed to prevent multi-front pressures and secure Bulgaria's western and northern borders. These measures allowed sustained focus on the Byzantine confrontation. Simeon understood that permanent domination required more than force. It required the careful orchestration of political, military, and religious elements to consolidate achievements and ensure long-term authority. The culmination of these efforts positioned Bulgaria as a formidable empire in Eastern Europe. Under Simeon, the Bulgarian state was no longer simply a rival to Byzantium. It was a contender for the legacy of Rome itself. Cities, armies, churches, and administrative institutions all reflected the ambition of a ruler determined to redefine the hierarchy of power in the Balkans. Simeon's reign demonstrated that strategic vision, disciplined execution, and the integration of multiple domains of authority could elevate a state from regional power to a contender for imperial recognition. Yet the struggle was far from concluded. Byzantium, though weakened, remained a sophisticated and resourceful adversary. The long-standing rivalry between the two empires would continue to evolve, shaped by the lessons of battle, diplomacy, and cultural influence established under Simeon. His campaigns set precedents for both military engagement and political strategy, influencing the approaches of future Bulgarian and Byzantine rulers. The ambition to supplant Byzantium as the heir to Rome defined this era, leaving a legacy of audacity, calculated aggression, and the relentless pursuit of legitimacy. By the end of Simeon's reign, Bulgaria had reached the height of its territorial and cultural power. His vision of imperial ambition, combined with military skill, political acumen, and religious strategy, positioned the empire as a central actor in the Balkans. Simeon the Great would be remembered as the Bulgarian Caesar, a ruler whose aspirations challenged the mightiest empire of the age, reshaped the contours of power, and left an indelible mark on the history of Eastern Europe. The Siege of Constantinople, a near collapse. The Siege of Constantinople under Simeon the Great represents the apex of Bulgarian ambition and the moment when the empire came closest to toppling Byzantium. By the early 10th century, Simeon's campaigns had expanded Bulgaria's influence across the Balkans, and his armies had achieved victories that forced the Byzantines into desperate defense. The Queen of Cities, Constantinople, had survived centuries of sieges, rebellions, and external threats. Yet in this period, Bulgaria, under Simeon's command, approached a threshold that few contemporaries would have imagined possible. The preparations for the siege reflected Simeon's understanding of the stakes. The city had natural and constructed defenses, the massive Theodosian walls, the Golden Horn, and a network of forts guarding every approach. These fortifications had thwarted countless enemies over the centuries, yet Simeon's ambition demanded audacity and innovation. His forces were organized to isolate the city, cut off supply routes, and exert psychological pressure on its population and defenders. It was not merely a military campaign, it was a calculated attempt to project authority, challenge imperial legitimacy, and force Byzantium to acknowledge Bulgaria as a peer empire. The siege itself tested the endurance and resilience of both sides. Bulgarian forces surrounded Constantinople, engaging in skirmishes at the walls and controlling surrounding territories to prevent reinforcements. The city's defenders, aware that failure would mean not only loss of territory, but the collapse of their political and religious system, resisted fiercely. For months, the standoff persisted, marked by tense engagements, supply shortages, and constant maneuvering. Each side measured the consequences of every action, knowing that the outcome would redefine power in the Balkans. Simeon's strategic acumen was evident in his approach. Rather than a headlong assault, he relied on attrition, cutting off trade and isolating the city from its hinterlands. He attempted to manipulate internal Byzantine politics, hoping that factions within Constantinople might weaken its defense or even open the gates. His goal was to force recognition of his authority without necessarily destroying the city, understanding that the capture of Constantinople carried both symbolic and practical risks. The Bulgarian army needed the siege to be decisive yet measured, capable of sustaining pressure without overextending resources or provoking catastrophic counterattacks. Byzantium, for its part, drew on its centuries of defensive experience. The emperor coordinated reinforcements, fortified critical points, and maintained morale among the population. Skilled engineers repaired breaches, deployed countermeasures, and ensured that the city remained viable under pressure. Religious and civic leaders emphasized the sacred nature of the city, framing its defense as both a spiritual and political imperative. The Byzantine response was informed by history, strategy, and the necessity of survival, demonstrating why Constantinople had endured for centuries against countless threats. Despite intense efforts, Simeon's forces never fully breached the walls. Skirmishes at the gates and near the Golden Horn inflicted casualties on both sides, yet the city held. Bulgarian forces demonstrated remarkable discipline and persistence, but the logistical challenges of sustaining a prolonged siege so far from the empire, its core territories, proved significant. Food, supplies, and reinforcements had to be managed carefully, and the risk of attrition, disease, and Byzantine counterattacks loomed constantly. The siege tested the limits of Bulgarian military capability and the endurance of its leadership. The psychological impact of the siege on Byzantium was profound. The proximity of Bulgarian forces to Constantinople, combined with the empire's inability to decisively repel them, created fear and uncertainty. The threat of collapse permeated imperial decision-making, influencing negotiations, military deployments, and internal politics. Citizens and elites alike were acutely aware of the stakes. The loss of the city would mean the end of imperial authority, the disruption of religious hierarchy, and the collapse of centuries of accumulated prestige and power. Simeon's vision extended beyond the military campaign. He sought recognition as the heir to Rome, as the legitimate ruler of a Christian empire capable of supplanting Byzantium. The siege was not merely an act of conquest, it was a declaration of legitimacy. Each engagement, each strategic maneuver was intended to demonstrate Bulgaria's capability, its endurance, and its claim to imperial authority. The psychological dimension of the siege was as critical as the physical, creating a sense of inevitability and testing the resolve of both defenders and attackers. The failure to capture Constantinople did not diminish the significance of the campaign. Bulgaria had demonstrated the capacity to threaten the most powerful city in Eastern Europe, to challenge the authority of the Byzantine emperor directly, and to assert a vision of imperial parity. The siege underscored the effectiveness of Simeon's military reforms, the discipline of his forces, and the strategic sophistication developed over decades of preparation and prior campaigns. It also highlighted the resilience of Byzantium, which, despite vulnerability, retained the ability to resist even the most determined adversary. Simeon's near success had lasting consequences. It forced Byzantium to reconsider its northern strategy, reinforce fortifications, and engage in diplomacy with renewed urgency. For Bulgaria, the siege represented both the height of ambition and a lesson in the limits of military power. While Constantinople remained unconquered, the campaign solidified Bulgaria's reputation as a peer empire, capable of threatening the most prestigious and strategically significant city in the region. Recognition, prestige, and influence were enhanced even in the absence of complete victory. The historical record emphasizes the dramatic tension of this period. Chroniclers of both Bulgaria and Byzantium noted the scale of forces, the intensity of engagement, and the near collapse of imperial authority. The siege became emblematic of the stakes involved in the Bulgarian-Byzantine rivalry, demonstrating the interplay between ambition, military capability, and strategic planning. It also reinforced the idea that power was not only measured by territorial conquest, but by the ability to shape perception, enforce respect, and project influence. Simeon's approach during the siege reflected a synthesis of military innovation, diplomatic calculation, and symbolic ambition. He leveraged victories in the field to pressure the Byzantines politically, attempted to manipulate internal divisions within Constantinople, and maintained the integrity of his own state to sustain the campaign. This multidimensional strategy highlighted the complexity of medieval warfare and politics, illustrating how rulers had to balance ambition, practicality, and long-term objectives in a context of persistent rivalry. The near collapse of Constantinople demonstrated that Bulgaria had become a formidable power in the Balkans. Simeon's reign marked the transition from regional challenge to existential threat, compelling Byzantium to confront the reality of a rival capable of contesting its supremacy. The siege created a legacy of strategic innovation, political calculation, and enduring rivalry that would shape the relationship between the two empires for generations. It also left a lasting impression on the collective memory of both states, underscoring the power of ambition, preparation, and the interplay between military might and political legitimacy. Ultimately, the siege of Constantinople under Simeon the Firm exemplified the apex of Bulgarian aspiration. The campaign was not merely a military endeavor, but a statement of imperial intent, a test of endurance, and a measure of the evolving balance of power in the medieval Balkans. While the city remained unconquered, the siege demonstrated that Bulgaria had the capability, leadership, and strategic vision to challenge Byzantium at the highest level. The period stands as a testament to the ambition of Simeon the Great, the resilience of Constantinople, and the enduring complexity of a rivalry that shaped Eastern European history. The long Bulgarian Golden Age and Byzantine resilience. The aftermath of Simeon's campaigns did not bring peace, but it brought something unexpected, a flourishing of art, language, and intellect in a region still defined by war. While soldiers guarded borders and spies watched for betrayal, monks copied manuscripts, poets composed verses, and architects raised churches from burned ground. The Balkans, so often described as a frontier of violence, became for a time a center of creation. From the ashes of conflict arose a civilization that would influence generations far beyond its borders. This era, now remembered as the Bulgarian Golden Age, stood as one of the most remarkable contradictions in medieval history. Simeon the Great, warrior and scholar alike, transformed his empire from a martial state into a cultural beacon. Even as his armies confronted Byzantine defenses, his scribes were at work in Preslav and Ohrid, translating religious texts, refining the Cyrillic script, and laying the foundations for Slavic literary culture. The court at Preslav glittered with intellectual ambition, filled with scholars who saw language as a form of power equal to the sword. The emergence of this literary movement was no accident. It reflected Simeon's understanding that empire was sustained not only by conquest, but by identity. His campaigns against Byzantium sought not just to win territory, but to claim the mantle of civilization itself. The Byzantines prided themselves as heirs of Rome, guardians of orthodoxy, and patrons of learning. Simeon, educated in Constantinople during his youth, understood this cultural arrogance intimately. He resolved to create a Bulgarian counterpart, a court, a church, and a body of learning that could rival the prestige of the Byzantine world. In Preslav, artists and craftsmen adorned churches with carved stone reliefs, frescoes, and inscriptions in the new Slavic letters. The Preslav Literary School, along with its counterpart in Ohrid, became centers of translation and original composition. Religious texts were rendered into the Slavic tongue, ensuring that Christian doctrine reached the common people. Saints such as Clement of Ohrid and Nahum advanced the development of literacy, building on the work of Cyril and Methodius. Their efforts not only spread Christianity, but gave the Bulgarians a written voice, a means of preserving law, history, and theology in their own language. This cultural awakening strengthened the empire's internal cohesion. For decades, the Byzantine model of governance had dominated the region, with Greek serving as the language of administration, scripture, and prestige. The adoption of a Slavic liturgy broke that monopoly. Bulgaria became the first major Slavic state with an independent church and a written tradition distinct from Byzantium. This linguistic independence deepened national identity, giving form to what earlier generations had only felt, a sense of unity that transcended tribe, region, and local allegiance. The paradox of the Golden Age lay in its coexistence with near-constant warfare. The same generation that witnessed artistic brilliance also endured sieges, famine, and the toll of mobilization. The empire's borders were strained, its villages taxed, and its men called to arms repeatedly. Yet the vision of Simeon's court turned this adversity into purpose. Chronicles describe the court not as a place of idle luxury, but of restless energy, where the pursuit of glory through learning mirrored the pursuit of victory through battle. The pen and the sword served the same master. For Byzantium, this period was one of both humiliation and endurance. The empire had survived Simeon's siege, but its prestige suffered. Yet the Byzantines were never passive observers. Even in moments of weakness, they remained masters of adaptation. The imperial bureaucracy, honed over centuries, continued to function, managing resources, rebuilding defenses, and preserving unity in a realm beset by rebellion and invasion. Constantinople's intellectual life remained vibrant, its monasteries preserving manuscripts, and its scholars debating theology, law, and philosophy. The Byzantine court, under successive emperors of the Macedonian dynasty, undertook reforms to stabilize the empire. They reorganized the themes, or military provinces, reasserted control over rebellious governors, and restored the treasury. The empire that had once appeared on the verge of collapse slowly regained its strength. Diplomacy also became a weapon of survival. Marriage alliances, treaties, and the careful manipulation of frontier politics allowed Byzantium to recover lost influence. Both empires, Byzantine and Bulgarian, entered a strange symbiosis during this time. They fought, yet they imitated each other. Bulgarian rulers adopted Byzantine titles, ceremonial customs, and administrative systems. Byzantine architects studied Slavic designs and incorporated them into their provincial churches. The exchange was unspoken but constant. Cultural rivalry created mutual enrichment, even as armies continued to clash. The writings from this era reveal a shared preoccupation with divine favor and legitimacy. Bulgarian chronicles depicted Simeon as a ruler chosen by God, a Slavic Constantine who would bring enlightenment to his people. Byzantine texts, meanwhile, describe the empire as the eternal defender of the true faith, enduring persecution as proof of its righteousness. Each side used theology to frame political struggle, each claiming divine sanction for its cause. This competition of ideas became as fierce as any battle fought on the plains of Thrace or along the Danube. After Simeon's death in 927, Bulgaria entered a period of uneasy peace. The empire was vast, prosperous, and admired, but it faced the perennial danger of overextension. The new ruler, Peter I, sought to consolidate rather than expand. His reign marked a transition from the fiery ambition of conquest to the sober management of stability. Relations with Byzantium improved temporarily, sealed by a dynastic marriage and the recognition of the Bulgarian Patriarchate. For the first time, the Bulgarian Church was acknowledged as autonomous, a victory more lasting than any battlefield triumph. During Peter's reign, monasteries multiplied, trade flourished, and Bulgarian scholars continued their work. The capital remained a hub of cultural exchange, its scribes copying and illuminating manuscripts that would influence Slavic lands for centuries. Literature reached new heights, combining theology, moral reflection, and poetic expression. The ethos of the Golden Age persisted, even as the political landscape began to shift. Meanwhile, Byzantium watched and learned. The empire, though bruised, was never stagnant. Under emperors like Romanos I and Constantine VII, Byzantine learning experienced its own renewal. The Macedonian Renaissance, as historians later called it, saw a revival of classical studies, the compilation of encyclopedias, and the restoration of imperial pride. The Byzantines documented their laws, codified ceremonies, and expanded the training of civil servants. Constantinople once again became the intellectual lighthouse of the Mediterranean world. The coexistence of these two resurgent powers created a remarkable equilibrium. For a generation, neither could decisively dominate the other. Trade caravans crossed borders laden with goods, scholars corresponded through intermediaries, and monks debated theology in distant monasteries. Yet beneath this calm lay the memory of conflict and the anticipation of future wars. The peace of Peter's reign was fragile, maintained by diplomacy more than trust. In the broader landscape of Eastern Europe, this balance of power had lasting consequences. The Slavic world, once fragmented, now possessed written language, organized churches, and coherent political traditions. Byzantine missionaries and Bulgarian scholars alike spread literacy and faith across the region, influencing future kingdoms in Serbia, Croatia, and Rus. The competition between the two empires had produced not only conflict, but a shared civilizational legacy. The irony of the Bulgarian Golden Age is that its brilliance foreshadowed its decline. The cultural confidence of this era masked deep vulnerabilities, economic strain, aristocratic rivalry, and the growing pressure of external threats. Byzantium, revitalized and strategically cunning, would soon exploit these weaknesses. But for a time, the vision of Simeon-S scholars and Peter-S reformers created a moment of equilibrium that seemed to promise lasting peace. In both capitals, pride endured. In Constantinople, the court still regarded itself as the world's axis, the chosen city of God. In Preslav, the memory of victory and cultural triumph sustained a belief that Bulgaria had achieved parity with the ancient empire to its south. Two civilizations, mirror images of ambition and faith, had forged each other through rivalry. Their stories intertwined, one through endurance, the other through creation. The golden age of Bulgaria was therefore not only a chapter in national history, but a cornerstone of medieval Europe's spiritual and intellectual map. It demonstrated how the crucible of war could forge not only destruction, but identity. Out of bloodshed came language, art, and a sense of destiny that would echo through the Slavic world for centuries. Romanos the Fern and the defensive Byzantine counterstroke. The rise of Romanos the Fern Lekapenos marked a turning point in the long struggle between Byzantium and Bulgaria. His ascent to power came during a fragile moment for the Byzantine Empire, a moment defined by lingering fear from Simeon's campaigns, internal disputes among the aristocracy, and the growing realization that the empire could not afford further humiliation. Romanos was not born into the purple. He was a man of the fleet, a commander shaped by hardship and long years in imperial service. His rise demonstrated a truth that would define the next chapter of the conflict. Byzantium survived not because it was unassailable, but because it constantly found leaders capable of adaptation. Romanos became one of those leaders, a ruler committed to stabilizing the empire and reversing Bulgarian gains. His first priority was the stabilization of Constantinople. The city still bore the psychological scars of Simeon's near success. Romanos understood that a demoralized capital could not command loyalty from the provinces, nor could it manage a protracted rivalry. He reorganized the imperial household, asserted control over the bureaucracy, and restored discipline among the military elites. His actions projected confidence, a signal that the empire had entered a new phase. By presenting himself as the protector of the young Emperor Constantine VII, Romanos gained legitimacy and brought a sense of continuity during a time of uncertainty. Strategic reforms became central to his rule. The Byzantine army had suffered during Simeon's wars. Its themes, the military provinces that formed the backbone of imperial defense, needed revitalization. Romanos invested in repairing fortifications, replenishing garrisons, and improving the chain of command. Experienced officers were recalled to service, while new recruits were given training that emphasized discipline and coordination. Romanos believed that the future of Byzantium depended on a reliable and professional army. His reforms reflected an understanding that Bulgaria had become a formidable rival capable of coordinating large-scale campaigns. Byzantium could no longer rely on fragmented regional forces. It needed a unified military system. One of Romanos's most important contributions was the strengthening of the navy. The Byzantine fleet had been neglected for years, yet it remained a crucial asset. Control of the sea lanes ensured the movement of troops, the protection of trade, and the defense of Constantinople's harbors. Romanos revitalized the fleet with new ships, improved training for sailors, and increased funding for maritime defenses. This naval strength would later become a decisive factor in checking Bulgarian advances and securing alliances. The fleet acted as a mobile shield, allowing Romanos to respond quickly to threats and project imperial power far beyond the walls of the capital. Diplomacy was another cornerstone of Romanos's strategy. He recognized that Bulgaria's power under Peter I, though formidable, had its vulnerabilities. The Bulgarian state was experiencing internal tensions as the ambitions of Simeon's era gave way to the demands of administration and governance. Romanos sought to exploit these circumstances by encouraging diplomatic channels, opening negotiations that balanced firmness with the promise of stability. He used marriage alliances, trade agreements, and ecclesiastical negotiations to ease tensions without sacrificing strategic goals. This approach contrasted sharply with the confrontational tactics of previous rulers, signaling a shift toward a more nuanced understanding of statecraft. At the same time, Romanos refused to yield any impression of weakness. He strengthened Byzantine positions along the Balkans, re-established control over key fortresses, and maintained constant readiness for renewed conflict. Reports from the northern frontier were treated with utmost seriousness. Scouts and messengers provided regular updates on Bulgarian movements, ensuring that Romanos remained informed at all times. The empire understood that peace with Bulgaria could never be taken for granted, and preparations for war continued even during periods of negotiation. The defensive counterstroke began not with grand offensives, but with methodical preparation. Byzantium had learned from the mistakes of earlier campaigns. Romanos focused on securing supply lines, protecting trade routes, and ensuring that the army could sustain prolonged operations. His reforms improved the logistical backbone of the empire, allowing for controlled troop movements and the rapid reinforcement of vulnerable regions. This system made it difficult for Bulgarian forces to exploit sudden opportunities. The empire was no longer reactive, but increasingly capable of shaping the pace of conflict. As Romanos strengthened the empire internally, he also engaged in a broader geopolitical approach. The Byzantine Empire had enemies and potential allies across multiple frontiers. Romanos cultivated relations with the Pechenegs, the nomadic tribes north of the Danube. By encouraging these groups to pressure Bulgarian territories, he created a strategic diversion that forced Bulgaria to divide its resources. This maneuver did not lead to immediate conflict, but it demonstrated Romanos's understanding of the importance of indirect pressure. By shaping the geopolitical environment, Byzantium could weaken Bulgaria without risking immediate confrontation. While Bulgaria continued to enjoy cultural prosperity, its political and military position had begun to shift. Peter III's reign lacked the aggressive drive of Simeon's earlier campaigns. The Bulgarian court sought security through diplomacy rather than expansion. This shift created opportunities for Byzantium. Romanos recognized that a stable but cautious Bulgaria could be drawn into peaceful coexistence, especially if Byzantium demonstrated both strength and willingness to negotiate. The balance of power slowly began to tilt. A significant achievement of Romanos's diplomacy was the recognition of the Bulgarian Patriarchate. This acknowledgement provided Bulgaria with religious prestige, but came at a strategic cost. By recognizing Bulgarian ecclesiastical independence, Byzantium gained leverage in negotiations and prevented further escalation of hostilities. The agreement created a framework for peaceful relations and allowed Romanos to focus on internal reforms and external threats elsewhere. The treaty sealed by Romanos and Peter I marked a rare moment of stability in the long rivalry. Even in peace, the empire continued to strengthen its foundations. Romanos oversaw legal reforms, reorganized the tax system, and ensured that the economy remained stable. The empire's capacity to sustain military expenditure improved. Urban life in Constantinople revived, and trade routes reopened. These developments increased Byzantine confidence and reduced the fear that had paralyzed the court during Simeon's campaigns. The empire gradually regained the strength that would later allow the Macedonian dynasty to embark on ambitious reconquests. Byzantine resilience under Romanos did not rest solely on the ruler's decisions. The empire benefited from a strong intellectual tradition that encouraged systematic analysis and record-keeping. Scholars, administrators, and military officials worked together to create detailed manuals on warfare, diplomacy, and governance. These texts aim to preserve institutional memory and offer guidance for future leaders. The intellectual revival of Constantinople contributed to the empire's long-term stability and allowed it to adapt to changing circumstances. Romanos's reign also influenced the broader cultural identity of the empire. The sense of humiliation that had lingered from earlier defeats began to fade. The empire regained pride, reinforced by small but steady successes on the battlefield and by the renewed ability to negotiate from a position of stability. The people of Constantinople saw that their leaders were once again able to manage the complex demands of ruling a diverse and expansive realm. The empire rediscovered its resilience, a quality that had allowed it to survive countless crises in the past. In the context of the Bulgarian-Byzantine rivalry, Romanos served as a transitional figure. He did not lead sweeping campaigns against Bulgaria, nor attempt to destroy the Bulgarian state. Instead, he restored Byzantine confidence, reorganized the military, and prepared the empire for future confrontations. His approach ensured that Byzantium would remain capable of asserting itself in the decades to come. His reign laid the groundwork for the revival of Byzantine power that would reach its height under rulers like Nikephoros Phokas and John Tzimiskes. The defensive counterstroke of Romanos I therefore represented more than a series of reforms. It marked the moment when Byzantium shifted from survival to renewal. The empire began to reassert control over its borders, refine its military strategy, and reconnect with its own traditions of governance and scholarship. It emerged from a period of vulnerability with renewed strength and purpose. The rivalry with Bulgaria continued, but the tide had begun to turn. Byzantium was no longer the desperate empire struggling to avoid collapse. It had regained the confidence and capacity needed to confront its neighbor once more. The long war was entering a new phase, one shaped by the resilience of Byzantium and the gradual consolidation of its restored power. Byzantines strike back. The fall of the First Bulgarian Empire begins campaigns under John Tzimiskes. Political assassinations. Weakness within Bulgaria. The balance of power between Byzantium and Bulgaria began to shift dramatically in the second half of the 10th century. The stability that Bulgaria had enjoyed under Peter the Fern slowly eroded. Internal fractures widened, aristocratic ambitions grew, and external pressure mounted with each passing year. The empire that Simeon had built and that Peter had tried to preserve through diplomacy began to feel the weight of its own vulnerabilities. Against this backdrop, Byzantium entered a period of military resurgence, guided by commanders who possessed both discipline and strategic clarity. Among them stood John Tzimiskes, a figure whose campaigns marked the beginning of the end for the First Bulgarian Empire. Before John Tzimiskes rose to power, Byzantium had already begun to recover under the leadership of Nikephoros Phokas. Nikephoros had reformed the army, restored discipline among the elite units, and launched successful campaigns in the east. His victories against Arab forces restored confidence in the empire and strengthened the military apparatus that would be used against Bulgaria. Yet Nikephoros' rule ended abruptly when John Tzimiskes, once his trusted general, participated in the conspiracy that led to the emperor's assassination. The palace intrigue that placed Tzimiskes on the throne changed the direction of Byzantine policy. The new emperor was not content with managing the status quo. He intended to finish what Nikephoros had begun and restore full imperial authority across the Balkans. The condition of Bulgaria at this time made it particularly vulnerable. The long reign of Peter I had produced peace but also stagnation. The Bulgarian aristocracy had grown powerful and increasingly independent, eroding central authority. The economy, once supported by tribute and stable trade, suffered from both internal corruption and external pressures. More dangerous still was the emergence of the Rus under Sviatoslav, whose ambitions in the Balkans created a crisis that Bulgaria struggled to control. The arrival of the Rus army in Bulgarian territory was catastrophic. Villages, towns and fortresses were attacked with sudden ferocity. This intrusion exploited Bulgaria's internal divisions and destabilized the fragile balance that had survived after Simeon I's death. During this period, Bulgaria experienced a collapse of leadership. The death of Peter Varn and the capture of his sons created a vacuum that neither local nobles nor military commanders could adequately fill. The Bulgarian court fractured into factions. Some urged resistance against the Rus, others sought Byzantine support. Still others hoped to protect their own lands without regard for the larger imperial structure. This fragmentation made Bulgaria vulnerable to the rising power of Constantinople, which watched closely as the northern kingdom strained under the weight of invasion and internal discord. When John Tzimiskes ascended the throne, he inherited a geopolitical situation that presented both danger and opportunity. The Rus posed a threat to Byzantine interests as they pushed deeper into the Balkans. Their occupation of key Bulgarian strongholds suggested that they might challenge Byzantine control of the region. Tzimiskes recognized that any power capable of dominating Bulgaria could become a formidable rival to Byzantium. His response would define the next stage of the conflict. He resolved to confront the Rus directly, but his campaigns would also reshape the fate of Bulgaria itself. The emperor led his army northward in a carefully organized campaign. The Byzantine forces, strengthened by Nikephoros' earlier reforms, moved with precision. They crossed the Haemus Mountains and entered territories that had long been battlegrounds between Bulgaria and Byzantium. The Rus forces, known for their fierce combat style, resisted with determination, but Tzimiskes demonstrated superior coordination and strategic insight. His victories over the Rus did more than secure Byzantine interests. They exposed the fragility of Bulgarian rule. As the Rus retreated, the lands they had occupied were left weakened and disorganized. Tzimiskes advanced through these territories, encountering populations that had suffered under invasion and internal conflict. The campaigns of Tzimiskes marked the transformation of Byzantine strategy from defensive to assertive. The emperor understood that Bulgaria, weakened by internal divisions and external invasions, could no longer counter Byzantine power effectively. His victories allowed him to present himself as a liberator of Bulgarian lands from the Rus threat. Yet his intentions extended far beyond restoring order. The empire saw a chance to reassert control over territories that had been lost generations earlier. The fall of the First Bulgarian Empire began not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow absorption of lands destabilized by war and political chaos. Political assassinations and internal betrayals further accelerated Bulgaria's decline. The Bulgarian aristocracy, long strained by competing loyalties, succumbed to ambition. Nobles sought to protect their own interests, even at the expense of unity. Assassinations undermined central authority and shifted control unpredictably from one faction to another. Each death weakened the continuity of governance. Each betrayal fractured the remaining structure of the empire. These internal conflicts created an environment in which external threats could act with devastating effect. Tzimiskes capitalized on this situation. His diplomatic efforts targeted Bulgarian nobles who were uncertain about their future. Some sought Byzantine support against rivals. Others believed alignment with Constantinople would preserve their local power. The emperor's combination of military strength and political persuasion gradually eroded the cohesion of Bulgaria. Byzantine influence returned not through large-scale conquest alone, but through carefully calculated agreements that placed Bulgarian territories under imperial supervision. The campaigns against the Rus allowed Tzimiskes to present his actions as necessary for regional stability. At the same time, he ensured that the lands he reclaimed were firmly incorporated into the Byzantine sphere. The empire regained control of key fortresses and strategic routes. These victories reduced Bulgarian defenses and severed the geographical ties that had once connected distant provinces to the central authority in Preslav. Meanwhile, Bulgaria struggled to recover from the shock of invasion and internal treachery. The ruling class, divided and uncertain, could not muster a unified response. The common population endured hardship and instability, weakened by years of conflict. Regions that had once supported strong armies now lacked the resources to mobilize effective resistance. The empire that had challenged Constantinople under Simeon had become vulnerable to forces from both north and south. Tzimiskes continued his advance, consolidating control over Bulgarian territories and integrating them into the Byzantine administrative system. His victories created the foundation for a more direct confrontation with what remained of Bulgarian power. The unity that had defined Bulgaria during its rise no longer existed. Instead, the country faced the reality of fragmentation and the growing pressure of a revitalized Byzantium. The emperor's campaigns represented not merely military operations. They symbolized the resurgence of Byzantine confidence. Under his leadership, commanders coordinated movements with efficiency, supply lines were secured, and fortifications were strengthened across reclaimed territories. The empire projected stability and authority, attributes that appealed to regions weary of uncertainty. As Byzantine power expanded, Bulgaria contracted, leaving a legacy that reflected both the brilliance of its earlier achievements and the vulnerabilities that ultimately led to its decline. The beginning of the end for the First Bulgarian Empire lay in this complex interplay of military pressure, political instability, and the resurgence of Byzantine strength. The campaigns of John Tzimiskes did not immediately destroy Bulgaria, but they set in motion the processes that would bring its collapse into sharp focus. The empire that had once challenged Constantinople now faced an adversary stronger, more unified, and determined to reclaim its place at the center of Balkan power. Basil II, the Byzantine Bulgar slayer rise of Basil II. His iron-willed determination to settle the conflict once and for all. The emergence of Basil II as the dominant ruler of Byzantium marked a decisive turn in the long rivalry between the empire and Bulgaria. His reign would become one of the most enduring and formidable in Byzantine history. Yet Basil's rise was neither smooth nor assured. He inherited a throne surrounded by intrigue, contested by powerful aristocratic families, and burdened by the unfinished struggles of his predecessors. Despite the political turmoil that surrounded the early years of his rule, Basil's singular resolve shaped the destiny of Byzantium. His determination, forged during years of adversity, would ultimately drive him toward the final confrontation with Bulgaria. Basil II was still young when he assumed the throne as senior emperor. His early reign was overshadowed by regents, influential generals, and aristocratic factions who sought to manipulate imperial authority. The empire was large, wealthy, and culturally sophisticated, yet its political structure was fragile. The great families of Anatolia, enriched through generations of military service, held vast territories and armies of their own. These families believed they could shape imperial policy for their benefit. Basil, however, possessed a character that resisted such control. His stern discipline, sense of responsibility, and unwavering conviction set him apart. Though still inexperienced in the early years of his rule, he had already determined that he would not be a ceremonial emperor. He would rule with firmness, uphold imperial authority, and restore the strength of Byzantium. The challenge before him was immense. The empire faced threats on multiple fronts. Internal aristocratic rebellion threatened the unity of the state. The military system required reform to ensure that the emperor could command loyalty directly rather than rely on the ambitions of local magnates. Beyond the borders, Bulgaria remained a formidable presence. The empire had recovered momentum under John Tzimiskes, but Bulgaria persisted as an independent and determined rival. Basil recognized that the long conflict had reached a point of decisive transition. Byzantium could no longer permit a powerful state to exist immediately north of its capital, especially one capable of exploiting internal Byzantine discord. The rise of the Kometopuli dynasty in Bulgaria after the fragmentation of central authority created new challenges for Byzantium. Samuel, one of the four brothers of the dynasty, emerged as the dominant figure. Under his leadership, Bulgaria experienced a revival. Samuel reorganized the army, fortified strategic positions, and sought to restore Bulgarian independence and strength. His campaigns across the Balkans demonstrated both skill and ambition. He occupied territories weakened by earlier invasions, won support from local populations, and established himself as the central figure of resistance against Byzantine expansion. For Basil, Samuel's rise signaled that the conflict with Bulgaria had entered a new phase. Basil understood that the empire's survival depended on firm leadership. He realized that the aristocracy, if left unchecked, could fracture the state. Before confronting Bulgaria, he needed to secure unity at home. His early campaigns targeted rebellious nobles whose defiance threatened imperial authority. The rebellion led by Bardas Skleros, followed by that of Bardas Phocas, tested Basil's resilience. These uprisings were not mere challenges to policy, but existential threats to the emperor's ability to govern. Basil confronted these powerful men with patience, strategic calculation, and a deep understanding of the nature of power. He built alliances carefully, relied on loyal troops, and refused to yield. His victories restored imperial control and demonstrated that Byzantium was once again under the command of a ruler who could not be swayed or intimidated. The suppression of aristocratic rebellion strengthened Basil's confidence and freed his attention for the greater challenge to the north. Bulgaria, revitalized under Samuel, had expanded across the Balkans, establishing strongholds in the mountains and river valleys. Samuel's dominion stretched from the Adriatic to the Black Sea in various periods, creating a territorial arc that threatened Byzantine interests. His forces attacked imperial territories, seized fortresses, and engaged in raids that unsettled local populations. He aimed not only to preserve Bulgarian independence, but to expand its influence. His power across the Balkans demonstrated that Bulgaria was far from defeated. Basil saw in Samuel a leader who mirrored the ambition of earlier Bulgarian rulers. Yet Basil differed greatly from previous Byzantine emperors. He did not treat the rivalry as a contest of prestige or boundary disputes. He believed that the Bulgarian problem needed a final resolution. The long history of conflict had shaped the region for 2 centuries, and Basil intended to close this chapter permanently. His determination was rooted in a belief that stability in the Balkans required the removal of Bulgaria as an independent political force. Throughout his reign, he refused to accept partial victories or temporary settlements. He viewed compromise as an obstacle to lasting peace. The emperor's commitment to the campaign against Bulgaria defined his rule. He spent years preparing for the eventual showdown. His approach was methodical. He strengthened the army, ensured reliable logistics, and developed strategies that compensated for the geographical advantage enjoyed by Bulgarian forces. Basil understood that the rugged terrain of the Balkans favored defenders, and that the war would require persistence, patience, and the careful positioning of forces. The conflict would not be won quickly. It would require a combination of endurance and steady pressure. Basil's personal qualities shaped the course of the conflict. He was disciplined, austere, and unwavering. He spent more time with his soldiers than in the splendor of the palace. He rejected luxury, wore simple clothing, and maintained a strict routine. These habits earned him the respect of the army. Soldiers admired his endurance, his willingness to share their hardships, and his refusal to place himself above the demands of service. His leadership inspired loyalty, a quality essential for a campaign that would extend across decades. The struggle against Bulgaria became the central focus of Basil's reign. Year after year, he led his forces into the Balkans, capturing fortresses, cutting supply lines, and weakening Bulgarian defenses. His persistence was unmatched. Each campaign built upon the progress of the last. He refused to retreat, even in the face of setbacks. His commitment reflected his broader vision for Byzantium. He sought not only to defeat Bulgaria, but to secure the northern frontier once and for all. Samuel responded with equal determination. His forces adapted to the terrain, relied on the mobility provided by mountain passes, and launched counterattacks designed to slow Byzantine progress. The conflict became a test of endurance. Battles were fought in valleys, forests, and narrow mountain paths. Fortresses changed hands repeatedly. Each side endured hardship and loss, yet Basil's vision remained unchanged. He pressed forward with patience, refusing to allow Bulgaria the opportunity to recover. The rivalry between Basil and Samuel became one of the defining stories of medieval Eastern Europe. It demonstrated how the ambitions of two rulers could shape the fate of entire regions. Basil's relentless campaigns slowly eroded Bulgarian strength. His victories accumulated, and his control over strategic positions expanded. The Bulgarian state, once powerful under Simeon and later resilient under Samuel, began to weaken. Local leaders wavered in their support. Resources dwindled. The long war had taken its toll. Basil's determination became legendary. His approach to governance and warfare reflected an understanding that endurance was the path to victory. The emperor who had risen through adversity, suppressed rebellion, and restored imperial authority was now poised to bring the centuries-long conflict to its conclusion. His reputation as the Bulgar Slayer, a title that would later be associated with him, reflected the transformation of Byzantine fortunes under his rule. He had become the figure who embodied the empire's resurgence. As Bulgaria weakened and Byzantium advanced, the stage was set for the final chapters of the conflict. Basil's iron will, forged through hardship and sustained through relentless campaigns, would shape the destiny of both empires. The rivalry that had defined generations was nearing its decisive moment, and Basil stood at the center of history, prepared to finish what earlier emperors had begun. The 30 Years' War of Basil II versus Bulgaria, endless campaigning, hard winters, loyal generals, Bulgarian resistance. The conflict between Basil III and Bulgaria evolved into a prolonged struggle that lasted for 3 decades. This was not a single campaign or a brief confrontation. It was a war of endurance, fought across valleys, mountain passes, rivers, and fortified towns. It reshaped both empires and tested the limits of human resilience. The 30 Years' War, as historians later called it, reflected the determination of Basil II to end the Bulgarian question once and for all, and the extraordinary tenacity of Bulgaria as it fought to preserve its independence. The war began with a simple reality. Neither side was willing to yield. Basil had resolved that the northern frontier must be secured permanently, while Samuel of Bulgaria had committed himself to defending his realm against Byzantine encroachment. What followed was a relentless series of campaigns that drained resources, exhausted soldiers, and forced both rulers to rely on their most loyal commanders. The landscape of the Balkans became a vast battleground where shifting fortunes defined each passing year. The terrain played a defining role. The mountains that separated the two empires were both shield and trap. Bulgarian forces knew the valleys and slopes with intimate familiarity, using them to stage ambushes and delay the Byzantine advance. Basil learned that progress could not be measured in rapid conquests. Each mountain pass had to be secured. Each river crossing required preparation. Nature itself became an adversary. The winters were harsh, freezing rivers and covering paths with snow. The summers brought heat that exhausted soldiers and animals alike. Year after year, the emperor led his troops into these unforgiving landscapes, determined to break Bulgarian resistance through persistence. Basil's commanders became crucial to sustaining the long war. Loyal generals such as Nikephoros, Xiphias, and Constantine Diogenes distinguished themselves through discipline and adaptability. These men understood the emperor's expectations and shared his resolve. They coordinated with regional governors, managed supply lines, and ensured that fortified positions were maintained. Their loyalty allowed Basil to execute long and complex operations without fear of betrayal. The emperor trusted them with significant responsibilities, knowing that the war's success depended on consistent leadership across multiple fronts. The logistical challenges were immense. The army required food, horses, weapons, and constant reinforcement. The empire invested heavily in securing supply routes and repairing roads that had deteriorated over years of conflict. Engineers strengthened bridges and constructed fortifications at key points. The administrative apparatus of Byzantium was mobilized to support the military effort. Tax revenue was directed toward the war. Provinces near the front provided grain, livestock, and labor. This sustained logistical structure demonstrated the depth of Basil's preparation and the strength of the Byzantine state. Bulgarian resistance, however, remained formidable. Samuel and his successors understood that they could not match the empire in open field battles over long periods. Instead, they relied on mobility and the natural defenses of the land. They withdrew when necessary, regrouped in strongholds, and reappeared to strike Byzantine forces when opportunity arose. The Bulgarians fortified towns and mountain fortresses, creating networks of defenses that forced the Byzantines into long sieges. Local populations supported the resistance, providing supplies and intelligence. This support demonstrated the strength of Bulgarian identity and the memory of earlier triumphs. The hardship endured by soldiers on both sides created a shared experience of suffering. Byzantine troops marched through snow-filled passes and endured winters in makeshift camps. They fought battles in rugged terrain that offered little reward. Many returned year after year, driven by loyalty to Basil or by the simple reality that the empire demanded their service. Bulgarian fighters faced equal hardship. They defended their homeland, moved through forested paths, and survived on limited supplies when sieges cut off their access to resources. The endurance of these men became a testament to the human capacity for resilience. As the years passed, the war assumed a rhythm. Each campaign season brought new offensives. Basil would advance into Bulgarian territory, seize fortresses, and secure positions. Bulgarian forces would respond by harassing supply lines, launching raids, and reclaiming isolated locations. The conflict resembled a slow tightening of a vice. Byzantium advanced steadily, though rarely with dramatic speed. Bulgaria resisted fiercely, though its resources dwindled over time. This gradual shift reflected the nature of the war. Victory would not be achieved through sudden triumph, but through consistent pressure. The death of Samuel in 1014 changed the character of Bulgarian resistance, though it did not end it. Samuel had been the unifying figure of the Bulgarian state during the fiercest years of conflict. His leadership had inspired soldiers and maintained cohesion among the nobility. His death, brought on by shock after hearing of the defeat at Kleidion, created a leadership vacuum. His successors lacked the same authority and strategic skill. They attempted to continue the struggle, but the empire had grown stronger and more coordinated. Basil remained relentless, continuing the campaigns with the same intensity he had shown during Samuel's lifetime. Fortress after fortress fell to Byzantine forces as the war entered its final decade. Basil's policy was systematic. He sought to dismantle Bulgarian power by cutting off resources, isolating strongholds, and eliminating pockets of resistance. The emperor understood that the collapse of the Bulgarian state required the destruction of its military infrastructure and the weakening of regional leaders. His campaigns reflected this strategy. Villages and towns that resisted were subdued. Nobles were forced to submit or face extermination. The emperor's reputation as the Bulgar slayer grew during these final years, shaped both by battlefield victories and by the unwavering resolve he displayed. Even in decline, Bulgarian resistance displayed remarkable determination. Local commanders continued to defend their positions. Families supported warriors despite the hardship. Communities withdrew to mountain refuges, maintaining pockets of resistance long after central authority had weakened. This determination reflected centuries of identity forged in conflict with Byzantium. Although the empire was nearing collapse, the spirit of resistance had not disappeared. Basil's final campaigns demonstrated his mastery of strategy. He coordinated operations across multiple regions, ensured the participation of experienced generals, and maintained discipline throughout the army. His personal involvement inspired confidence. Soldiers saw him march at the front lines, endure the same hardships, and refuse to rest until objectives were achieved. His perseverance became legendary. He pursued the Bulgarian forces for years, refusing to allow them the time or space to recover. By 1018, the long war had reached its conclusion. The Bulgarian state, unable to sustain further resistance, submitted to Byzantine rule. Basil entered Ohrid, one of the last centers of Bulgarian authority, and accepted the allegiance of local leaders. His victory did not rely on a single decisive battle, but on the persistence that defined his rule. The 30 Years' War had ended. The First Bulgarian Empire was absorbed into Byzantium. The conflict left a lasting mark on both empires. For Byzantium, the war represented the culmination of decades of effort to restore dominance in the Balkans. Basil's victory consolidated imperial control and expanded the empire's borders. It also reinforced the authority of the emperor over the aristocracy and solidified the military system that had been reformed earlier in his reign. For Bulgaria, the war marked the end of an era. The state that had once challenged Byzantium at its height had fallen after generations of struggle. Yet the memory of the conflict endured in the collective consciousness of the region. The 30 Years' War between Basil II and Bulgaria stands as one of the most significant military contests of the medieval world. It demonstrated the limits of endurance, the complexity of mountain warfare, and the power of a ruler driven by unshakable conviction. The story of this conflict reveals how determination, loyalty, and identity shaped the destiny of nations. The final decisive years. Samuel of Bulgaria versus the Empire. The tragic figure of Tsar Samuel, his brilliance, his downfall. The final years of the long conflict between Bulgaria and Byzantium centered around the figure of Tsar Samuel, a ruler whose brilliance and determination stand among the most compelling stories in medieval Eastern Europe. His life embodied the struggle of a nation fighting against overwhelming odds. His reign captured the highest hopes of Bulgarian independence and the deepest tragedies of its decline. Among the many rulers who shaped the centuries-long rivalry between the two empires, Samuel remains one of the most memorable. His leadership, courage, and relentless resistance transformed him into a symbol of defiance. Yet the very qualities that made him formidable could not prevent the collapse that would unfold during the last years of his rule. Samuel's rise occurred at a moment when Bulgaria faced profound uncertainty. The death of Peter the Foe and the invasion by the Rus had fractured the political order. In the midst of this chaos, the Omurtag brothers seized the opportunity to restore authority. Among them, Samuel emerged as the most capable. He demonstrated strategic insight, charisma, and an ability to organize disparate factions into a functioning state. Under his leadership, Bulgaria regained coherence. He reorganized the army, re-established control over key fortresses, and revived the administrative structures that had weakened under earlier rulers. His ability to command loyalty from regional leaders allowed him to create stability where others had failed. Samuel's ambition extended beyond mere preservation. He envisioned a revival of Bulgarian power across the Balkans. His early campaigns reflected this ambition. He captured territories along the Vardar and Morava valleys, expanded influence into Thessaly and Epirus, and pushed the frontier deep into Byzantine lands. He used swift movements, mountain routes, and the loyalty of frontier populations to maintain momentum. His victories restored the morale of his people and demonstrated that Bulgaria was still capable of challenging its old rival. The early years of Samuel's reign revealed a ruler who understood the realities of his environment. Bulgaria no longer possessed the vast resources it had enjoyed under Simeon. It could not rely on overwhelming numbers or long sieges against well-fortified Byzantine cities. Instead, Samuel employed mobility, surprise, and local support. He established strongholds in mountainous regions and used them as bases for repeated incursions into Byzantine territory. His strategic approach reflected his deep familiarity with the geography of the Balkans and the logistical limits of his adversary. Despite his successes, Samuel faced a formidable opponent in Basil II. The Byzantine emperor pursued a methodical strategy that aimed to wear down Bulgarian resistance through persistent pressure. Each year, Basil launched campaigns that targeted Bulgarian fortresses, disrupted supply lines, and forced Samuel to respond. The emperor's endurance matched Samuel's resilience. The two rulers became symbols of their respective states, each committed to victory, each unwilling to concede ground. The conflict between them evolved into a prolonged duel that would define the fate of the region. Samuel's brilliance lay not only in his military skill, but in his ability to maintain the cohesion of a state under constant threat. He preserved unity among nobles who had previously pursued independent ambitions. He ensured that the common population supported his resistance by protecting their lands whenever possible and by responding quickly to threats. His leadership inspired loyalty. His presence in the field reassured his soldiers. His personal courage became legendary. Yet the burden of resistance placed enormous strain on the Bulgarian state. The military campaigns demanded constant mobilization. Agricultural production suffered. Trade routes were disrupted. Villages were destroyed by war and raids. The population endured hardship year after year. Samuel did everything in his power to sustain the war effort, but the structural limits of the state began to show. The empire he inherited had already been weakened by decades of turmoil and external invasion. His leadership slowed the decline, but could not reverse it entirely. The decisive turning point came with the Battle of Kleidion in 1014. Basil II launched a major campaign aimed at securing control over a strategic mountain pass that had long shielded Bulgarian territory. Samuel recognized the importance of the position and fortified the area with defensive works. The Bulgarians held the high ground, confident that the narrow terrain would protect them, yet Basil's forces executed a difficult maneuver. Guided by local knowledge, a Byzantine detachment circled behind the Bulgarian defenses and attacked from the rear. The Bulgarian army, caught between two forces, collapsed. It was one of the most devastating defeats Bulgaria experienced during the entire conflict. The consequences of the battle extended far beyond the loss of soldiers. The defeat shattered the morale of the Bulgarian forces. The capture of thousands of prisoners and the crushing of a major defensive position revealed that even Samuel's strategic insight could not always overcome the growing strength of Byzantium. When Samuel saw the remnants of his defeated army, he suffered a severe shock that led to his death soon after. His passing marked the symbolic end of Bulgarian resistance at its highest level. With Samuel gone, the unity he had maintained began to erode. The tragedy of Samuel lies not only in his downfall, but in the contrast between his achievements and the circumstances he faced. He was a ruler of exceptional talent, yet he inherited a state weakened by earlier generations. He revived Bulgaria and sustained it through decades of pressure, yet he could not overcome the persistent and methodical strategy of Basil II. His leadership prolonged the life of the First Bulgarian Empire, but the cumulative effects of war eventually overwhelmed the state. Samuel's successors lacked his authority. They attempted to continue the struggle, but their efforts were hindered by exhaustion, dwindling resources, and the loss of key fortresses. The administrative structures that supported Samuel's campaigns weakened. Regional leaders became more willing to negotiate with Byzantium. Local populations, burdened by the demands of war, saw no clear path to victory. Basil continued his campaigns with unwavering commitment. He captured strategic towns, secured mountain passes, and forced nobles to submit. His persistence completed the work that Samuel's death had begun. Yet the story of Samuel endures because his resistance defined an era. He represented the final expression of Bulgarian independence during the long millennium of Byzantine influence. His courage, intelligence, and dedication shaped the memory of the Bulgarian people and influenced the identity of later generations. His downfall, though tragic, revealed the immense pressure exerted by a revitalized Byzantium. The conflict between Basil II and Samuel stands as a testament to the complexity of medieval warfare, the significance of leadership, and the interplay of determination and fate. In the years following Samuel's death, the remaining fragments of Bulgarian authority continued to resist, but the momentum had shifted decisively. Basil's strategy, combined with internal fragmentation, ensured that the collapse of the First Bulgarian Empire was inevitable. Yet the legacy of Samuel lived on, preserved not only in chronicles, but in the collective memory of the region. His story represented the struggle of a people determined to defend their identity against overwhelming force. The Battle of Kleidion, the turning point, the legendary blinding of 14,000 prisoners and its historical debate. The Battle of Kleidion stands as one of the most defining and dramatic moments in the centuries-long conflict between Byzantium and Bulgaria. It represented the culmination of decades of struggle, the breaking point of Bulgarian resistance, and the moment when Basil II secured his place in history as the ruler who finally brought the First Bulgarian Empire to its knees. The battle occurred in 1014, at a time when the 30 Years' War between the two powers had drained both empires and reshaped the political landscape of the Balkans. Yet it was this single encounter, set in the rugged terrain near the Belasica Mountains, that became the turning point in the conflict. Bulgaria, under Tsar Samuel, had endured relentless pressure from Basil II. Year after year, the emperor launched campaigns that penetrated deeper into Bulgarian territory, dismantling fortresses and weakening the administrative structure of the state. Samuel, determined to defend his realm, relied on natural defenses and strategic fortifications. He understood that the mountainous regions offered Bulgaria its best chance for survival. The pass near Kleidion, narrow and steep, became one of the most fortified points in the entire region. Samuel recognized its significance and constructed a defensive wall across the pass, intending to block the imperial advance. The fortifications were manned by soldiers loyal to him, men who had experienced the hardships of constant warfare and understood the stakes of the moment. Basil approached the pass with caution. He recognized the difficulty of attacking a well-defended position in such terrain. A frontal assault would have been costly. The Bulgarian defenders held the high ground, controlled the narrow path, and had the advantage of prepared positions. The emperor studied the landscape carefully. He ordered reconnaissance of the surrounding mountains, looking for alternative routes. Basil understood that the only way to take the position was through deception or maneuver. His patience and attention to strategy, traits that had defined his long campaign, guided his decisions. A Byzantine detachment, led by the experienced commander Nicephorus Xiphias, found a path that circled behind the Bulgarian positions. The climb was difficult and required movement through thick forests and uneven ground. Yet the detachment persevered. When they reached the heights above the Bulgarian defences, they waited for the coordinated moment to strike. Basil prepared his main force to engage the defenders directly. The battle began with the Byzantine army advancing toward the fortified barrier. The Bulgarian soldiers, confident in their defensive position, resisted the initial assault. The narrow space worked in their favor. They repelled the attackers and inflicted casualties through well-timed counterattacks. The battle seemed to favor the defenders. Yet the decisive moment came when Xiphias launched his surprise attack from behind. The Bulgarians, caught between two forces, lost their cohesion. Panic spread along the defensive line. The fortified wall that had seemed impenetrable became a trap. Soldiers attempting to retreat were pressed against their own defenses, unable to escape the coordinated assault. The collapse of the Bulgarian position resulted in one of the most devastating defeats in the history of the First Bulgarian Empire. Thousands of soldiers were captured. The destruction of the defensive system at Kleidion opened the way for further Byzantine advances. The battle represented not just a tactical victory, but the moral and psychological collapse of Bulgarian resistance. The defenders, who had expected to halt Basil II's advance instead, found themselves overwhelmed by a combination of strategy and perseverance. The aftermath of the battle produced one of the most famous and debated episodes in medieval history. According to later accounts, Basil II ordered the mass blinding of 14,000 Bulgarian prisoners, leaving one man in each 100 with one eye to guide the others back to Samuel. These accounts, recorded by chroniclers such as John Skylitzes, describe Samuel collapsing from shock when he saw his blinded army. His health, already strained by years of war and pressure, deteriorated rapidly, and he died shortly after. This story became one of the most enduring images associated with Basil II. It shaped his reputation as the Bulgar slayer and contributed to the mythic narrative of Byzantine severity. However, the historical debate surrounding the blinding persists. Some scholars argue that the figure of 14,000 is an exaggeration, reflecting the chronicler's dramatic intention rather than precise record-keeping. Others suggest that the blinding, if it occurred, may have involved fewer prisoners, or may have been carried out in a different manner than described. The question remains contested because the sources, written decades later, contain elements of both historical reporting and political symbolism. The image of an emperor ordering such a punishment served as a powerful statement about imperial dominance, yet its accuracy remains uncertain. Whether literal or symbolic, the story reflects the intensity of the rivalry between the two empires. The blinding, as recorded, represented a calculated message. It demonstrated the consequences of resisting imperial authority. It also reflected Basil's determination to end Bulgarian independence completely. For the emperor, the war had endured long enough. He believed that only through harsh measures could the conflict finally be resolved. His strategic thinking did not separate war from political communication. Every action carried significance. Every decision influenced the morale of both his army and his enemies. The impact of Kleidion on Bulgaria was immediate and profound. Samuel, who had sustained the resistance for decades, suffered a shock that weakened his capacity to lead. His death shortly after the battle removed the figure who had maintained national unity. The Bulgarian aristocracy, already strained by years of pressure, struggled to preserve cohesion. The defeat at Kleidion accelerated the collapse of Bulgarian resistance. The loss of so many soldiers, combined with the destruction of a key defensive position, broke the coordinated military capacity of the state. The aftermath also strengthened Basil's resolve. The victory validated his long campaign and reinforced his belief that persistence would lead to the restoration of Byzantine control over the Balkans. He continued his military operations with renewed energy, capturing fortresses, accepting the surrender of local leaders, and integrating Bulgarian territories into the imperial system. Kleidion marked the moment when victory shifted from possibility to inevitability. The Battle of Kleidion therefore stands as a defining moment, not only in the conflict between Byzantium and Bulgaria, but in the broader history of the medieval Balkans. It represents the convergence of leadership, strategy, and geographical challenge. It reveals the interconnectedness of national identity, military endurance, and political ambition. For Bulgaria, it marked the beginning of the final stage of collapse. For Byzantium, it opened the path to consolidation and renewed dominance. The debate surrounding the blinding reflects the difficulty of interpreting medieval sources. Chroniclers often shape narratives to convey moral lessons, political messages, or dramatic impact. Yet even if the details remain uncertain, the significance of the story is clear. It symbolizes the severity of the war, the intensity of Byzantine resolve, and the depth of Bulgarian suffering. It also demonstrates how memory and history intertwine, creating stories that endure long after the battles themselves are forgotten. Kleidion remains one of the most memorable moments of the medieval world because it captures the essence of the long rivalry. It shows how determination could lead to triumph, how resistance could endure against overwhelming force, and how a single battle could reshape the destiny of nations. The story of Kleidion, with all its triumph and tragedy, stands as a reminder of the human experience behind the chronicles of empires. Collapse and absorption. The end of the First Bulgarian Empire, aftermath of Basil II's campaigns, administrative changes, why Bulgaria did not vanish culturally. The final stage of the long conflict between Byzantium and Bulgaria unfolded with a mixture of inevitability and profound transformation. After the Battle of Kleidion and the death of Tsar Samuel, Bulgaria entered a period of accelerating decline. The state that had endured for centuries, weathered invasions, and produced moments of brilliance began to unravel under the sustained pressure of Basil II's relentless campaigns. The collapse did not occur in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolded through a sequence of surrenders, administrative changes, and shifting loyalties that gradually brought the First Bulgarian Empire under Byzantine authority. Yet despite the political absorption, the cultural identity of Bulgaria endured, shaped by centuries of struggle and enriched by the achievements of its golden age. The death of Samuel left Bulgaria without the unifying leadership that had sustained resistance for decades. His successors lacked the authority and strategic competence required to hold together a state already weakened by internal strain. The new rulers, including Gavril Radomir and later Ivan Vladislav, attempted to continue the struggle. They led campaigns, fortified towns, and tried to maintain the morale of their forces, yet their efforts were fragmented, reactive, and hindered by diminishing resources. The Bulgarian aristocracy, once bound together by Samuel's determination, began to consider survival more important than continued resistance. The unity that had defined the earlier years of war dissolved. Basil II, aware of the shifting situation, intensified his efforts. His campaigns moved through Macedonian and Western Bulgarian territories with increasing confidence. He captured fortresses one after another. His administrative skill ensured that each newly conquered region was secured quickly and incorporated into imperial structures. Local leaders who chose to submit were treated with calculated leniency. Their cooperation allowed Basil to stabilize the region without relying solely on military occupation. The emperor understood that lasting control required the willing participation of local elites, not just the presence of imperial soldiers. The fall of Ohrid marked a symbolic turning point. As the spiritual and political heart of Samuel's regime, the city's surrender represented the end of effective Bulgarian central authority. When representatives from the remaining Bulgarian regions met Basil and offered their allegiance, the emperor accepted their submission with a combination of ceremony and pragmatism. He recognized that a smooth transition required acknowledging the significance of local traditions and institutions. By accepting their allegiance rather than imposing harsh, punitive measures, he ensured that the region would integrate more easily into the Byzantine world. The administrative changes that followed reflected Basil's understanding of governance. Rather than dismantling Bulgarian institutions entirely, he adapted them to suit imperial needs. Bulgaria was reorganized into a series of themes, the administrative units that formed the backbone of Byzantine provincial rule. Governors appointed by the emperor oversaw taxation, justice, and military responsibilities. Yet in many places, local leaders retained influence, serving as intermediaries between the population and the imperial administration. This approach minimized unrest and preserved elements of the existing social structure. Basil also took care to respect the Bulgarian church. Although the Bulgarian Patriarchate was downgraded to an archbishopric, it remained autonomous in its internal affairs and continued to use the Slavic liturgy. This decision was crucial. The church had been central to Bulgarian identity since the conversion under Boris I. It provided spiritual authority, cultural continuity, and a written tradition that connected the population to its past. By preserving its autonomy, Basil ensured that religious life would not become a source of rebellion. The archbishopric, based in Ohrid, continued to influence regional culture for centuries, shaping the spiritual landscape even under imperial rule. The administrative incorporation of Bulgaria into the Byzantine Empire brought economic stabilization. Trade routes opened. Agricultural production recovered from decades of warfare. Towns resumed normal rhythms of life. Imperial taxation replaced the ad hoc levies that had supported constant military mobilization. While taxes were often heavy, the restoration of peace allowed many communities to rebuild. Craftsmen returned to workshops, markets filled again, and families resumed the rhythms of daily life. The trauma of conflict slowly gave way to the practical concerns of work, worship, and community. Despite political collapse, Bulgaria did not vanish culturally. The endurance of Bulgarian identity can be attributed to several factors. The first was the strength of the Slavic liturgy and the written tradition developed during the Golden Age. Cyrillic script, refined in Preslav and Ohrid, remained the primary means of writing. Monasteries continued to copy manuscripts, preserve saints' lives, and teach young clerics. The presence of a written language created continuity that survived political change. Communities could retain their sense of belonging because they continued to speak, write, and pray in the same language. The second factor was the resilience of local customs. Rural communities often continued their traditional practices with little interruption. Byzantine administration focused primarily on taxation and security, leaving cultural life largely untouched. Folk traditions, seasonal rituals, and local governance practices persisted. Families passed stories of kings, battles, and saints to their children, preserving collective memory. Even under imperial rule, these memories retained the outlines of Bulgarian independence and the pride associated with it. The third factor was the Byzantine approach to regional governance. Basil II enforced imperial authority without attempting to erase local identity. He recognized that cultural assimilation required continuity, not disruption. By preserving the autonomy of the church, maintaining elements of the administrative structure, and allowing local elites to retain influence, he created an environment in which Bulgarian culture could adapt rather than disappear. The memory of earlier rulers played a significant role in preserving national consciousness. The stories of Krum, Boris, Simeon, and Samuel continued to circulate among the population. These figures embodied strength, resilience, and leadership. Their achievements were celebrated in oral tradition and liturgical texts. The memory of Samuel in particular, who had stood against Byzantium for decades, remained strong. His image as a defender of Bulgarian independence shaped the cultural imagination long after the empire itself had fallen. As Byzantine control settled over the region, the long process of integration began. Imperial influence introduced new administrative practices, expanded trade networks, and connected Bulgarian towns to wider economic systems. Yet even within this structure, Bulgarian identity remained distinct. Over time, the presence of local clergy, teachers, and landowners ensured that traditions continued. The population adapted to Byzantine rule without abandoning its sense of heritage. The collapse of the First Bulgarian Empire therefore represented a political event rather than a cultural extinction. The transformation of the region revealed the complex relationship between empire and identity. Political structures could fall, but cultural traditions, language, and collective memory endured. The centuries-long conflict had forged a strong sense of belonging among the Bulgarian people. Even under imperial rule, this identity remained intact. The absorption of Bulgaria into Byzantium under Basil II marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The region became an integral part of the empire for several generations, yet the legacy of the First Bulgarian Empire continued to shape the future. When a new Bulgarian state emerged in later centuries, it drew heavily on the cultural and spiritual foundations established during earlier periods. The resilience of Bulgarian identity, preserved through language, faith, and memory, ensured that the nation would reappear in the medieval world long after its first empire had fallen. Legacy of a 200-year war, the long memory of conflict, cultural blending, the rise of the Second Bulgarian Empire, shaping of Balkan identity and modern borders. The long conflict between Byzantium and Bulgaria left a legacy that extended far beyond the fall of the First Bulgarian Empire. The 2 centuries of war created enduring memories, shaped identities, and influenced the political landscape of the Balkans in profound ways. The story of the rivalry did not end with Basil II's final victory. Instead, the memory of the struggle continued to influence communities, monarchs, and cultures across the region. The war shaped traditions, created myths, and defined relationships that would echo through medieval and modern history. The memory of conflict persisted because it was woven into the experiences of generations. The rivalry was not an isolated series of battles, but a constant presence in the lives of Bulgarians and Byzantines alike. Families had seen fathers, brothers, and sons serve in campaigns. Villages had endured raids, sieges, and shifting borders. Markets, monasteries, and towns had changed rulers repeatedly. This prolonged exposure to conflict left an imprint on collective consciousness. Stories of victory and defeat were preserved in oral traditions, monastic writings, and community gatherings. The memory of Samuel's resistance, Simeon's ambitions, and Boris's conversion lived on through generations, creating a sense of historical continuity that survived political collapse. The legacy of the conflict also revealed itself in cultural blending. Despite the intensity of warfare, the populations of Byzantium and Bulgaria interacted constantly. Trade routes passed through contested territories. Traders, craftsmen and travelers moved across borders in times of peace and truce. Monks copied manuscripts, translated texts and exchanged theological ideas. Over time, Byzantine artistic styles influenced Bulgarian churches and icons, while Slavic liturgical traditions affected religious practices within imperial provinces. Marriage between local elites further connected communities. These interactions created a shared cultural fabric that blurred simple lines between conqueror and conquered. The absorption of Bulgaria into the Byzantine Empire accelerated this blending. Byzantine governors, soldiers and administrators worked alongside local leaders. Bulgarian clergy maintained religious traditions even as they communicated with the imperial church. The Cyrillic script, developed during the Bulgarian Golden Age, spread further into the Slavic world, reaching the lands of Serbia and Rus. Byzantine court customs influenced Bulgarian noble families, yet local customs remained strong in rural regions. The result was a cultural landscape where Byzantine influence coexisted with Slavic identity. This coexistence created a foundation upon which future states would build. The fall of the First Bulgarian Empire did not mark the end of Bulgarian political identity. Instead, it created conditions that eventually led to the rise of the Second Bulgarian Empire. The memory of earlier independence, combined with the preservation of language, church and local customs, allowed a new political movement to emerge in the 12th century. The rebellion led by the brothers Asen and Peter ignited a renewed sense of unity. Their success in restoring a Bulgarian state demonstrated the resilience of a culture that had not vanished under imperial rule. The Second Bulgarian Empire drew heavily on the traditions of the First. Its rulers invoked the memory of Simeon and Samuel. Its church drew authority from centuries of Slavic Christianity. Its political structure combined elements of Byzantine administration with native customs. The revival of the state confirmed that cultural endurance could outlast political defeat. The long conflict also played a central role in shaping the identity of the Balkans. The rivalry between Byzantium and Bulgaria influenced the development of future regional powers. The interactions between Slavic, Greek, and Latin cultures created a mosaic of traditions. The struggle for control of trade routes, fortresses, and river valleys helped shape the political geography of the region. When new states arose, including Serbia, Hungary, and various principalities, they inherited borders and strategic priorities that had been shaped during the Bulgarian-Byzantine Wars. Each successor state understood the significance of mountain passes, fortresses, and key towns because these locations had been contested for generations. The war also shaped religious identity. Bulgaria's decision to adopt Christianity and a Slavic liturgy preserved a cultural distinction that survived Byzantine political control. The Orthodox tradition became a unifying force in the region, influencing the development of Serbia and Rus. Byzantine missionaries and Bulgarian scholars contributed to a shared spiritual and cultural space that extended across Eastern Europe. This religious identity, defined by liturgy, script and church structure, became central to regional identity long after political borders shifted. Modern borders and national narratives continue to reflect the impact of this medieval rivalry. The memory of the First Bulgarian Empire and the centuries of conflict with Byzantium is deeply rooted in Bulgarian historical consciousness. Bulgarian national identity draws inspiration from the golden age of literature, the courage of Samuel, and the endurance of the people under foreign rule. In Greece and other regions shaped by Byzantine heritage, The memory of Basil II's campaigns and Byzantine resilience plays an equally significant role. These narratives, though shaped by later eras, reflect a genuine historical foundation created by centuries of interaction. The memory of the war not only shaped national narratives, but also contributed to the broader understanding of empire and identity. The conflict between Byzantium and Bulgaria highlights the complexity of medieval statecraft, where political rivalry coexisted with cultural exchange. It reveals how the rise and fall of states can coexist with the persistence of cultural identity. It also demonstrates how geography, religion, and leadership influence the fate of nations. The legacy of the 200-year war is therefore multifaceted. It reveals a story of endurance, transformation, and renewal. It shows how the interplay of conflict and cooperation shaped the Balkan world. It highlights the strength of cultural identity and the capacity of communities to survive political collapse. It demonstrates that history is not merely the story of empires rising and falling, but of peoples adapting, remembering, and rebuilding. When the Second Bulgarian Empire emerged, it did so with a sense of continuity and purpose. It inherited the spiritual traditions, literary achievements, and historical memory of its predecessor. It interacted with Byzantium as both rival and successor, contributing to a renewed cycle of influence. Thus, the legacy of the Long War extended far beyond the 11th century. It shaped medieval politics, influenced cultural development, and left a lasting imprint on the identity of the region. The 200-year conflict between Byzantium and Bulgaria stands as one of the defining stories of the medieval Balkans. It reflects the complexity of human ambition, the endurance of cultural identity, and the intricate relationship between power and memory. It reveals how conflict can destroy political structures, but strengthen cultural ones. It shows how generations of struggle can produce both division and unity. The legacy of this war remains visible in language, religion, borders, and national consciousness. It is a reminder that history's greatest struggles often leave their deepest mark on the minds of the people who endure them. A sweeping reflection on endurance, identity, and the long memory of a two-century war. The story of the Bulgarian-Byzantine conflict, stretching across 200 years, is more than a sequence of battles, treaties, and shifting frontiers. It is a lesson in endurance, transformation, and the complexity of human history. It reveals how nations are shaped not only by victory, but also by survival. It shows how identity is forged through both triumph and suffering. As the long war draws to its symbolic close, the deeper meaning of the struggle emerges with clarity. Behind the armies and rulers lived millions of ordinary people whose lives were touched by war, peace, faith, and the passage of time. Their collective experience offers insight into how the medieval world became the foundation of modern Europe. For Byzantium, the two-century conflict demonstrated the resilience of an empire that refused to surrender its place in the world. The empire faced invasions, internal rebellions, and the near collapse of its authority, yet it endured. Its rulers, from Heraclius to Basil II, confronted crises that would have destroyed lesser states. Their persistence revealed a political culture that valued adaptation and continuity. Byzantium emerged from the conflict with renewed strength, yet its victory came at a cost. It had spent generations defending its borders, mobilizing its population, and preserving its traditions. The survival of the empire was not guaranteed by military power alone. It depended on administrative discipline, intellectual depth, and a shared sense of purpose that transcended individual rulers. For Bulgaria, the 2 centuries of struggle produced a story of remarkable ascent, cultural brilliance, and heroic resistance. The early Bulgarian state forged its identity under the pressures of diplomacy, warfare, and religious transformation. The conversion to Christianity, the creation of a Slavic liturgy, and the development of the Cyrillic script established a foundation that would endure long after political independence faded. Bulgaria's golden age revealed that culture can flourish even in times of conflict. Its rulers promoted learning and spirituality, creating a legacy that shaped the Slavic world for centuries. Even after the fall of the First Bulgarian Empire, its spiritual and cultural achievements remained intact, ready to support future revival. The two-century war taught both empires a profound lesson about identity. Neither state remained the same after generations of conflict. Byzantium emerged as a more disciplined and centralized empire. Bulgaria emerged as a nation defined not only by its rulers, but by its language, faith, and collective memory. The struggle forced each side to articulate its place in the world. For Byzantium, the rivalry reaffirmed its self-image as the guardian of Roman heritage and Christian civilization. For Bulgaria, it created a sense of historical purpose and belonging that would survive conquest. Language played a central role in this transformation. The development of the Slavic liturgy and the spread of Cyrillic writing created a cultural boundary that no conquest could erase. Language became a vessel of memory, a way for communities to preserve their stories and traditions even under foreign rule. Bulgarian identity survived because ordinary people continued to speak, write, and worship in their own language. The endurance of Cyrillic would influence the history of Serbia, Rus, and other Slavic lands, extending the legacy of the conflict across Eastern Europe. Religion also shaped the long aftermath of the war. The adoption of Christianity connected Bulgaria to the broader Christian world and provided spiritual stability through centuries of political upheaval. The Bulgarian Church, even under Byzantine authority, continued to nurture local traditions and preserve the memory of the early rulers. Byzantium, as the center of Eastern Christianity, spread theological ideas that influenced Bulgarian thought, yet the Slavic liturgy ensured that faith did not erase national identity. This combination of shared belief and distinct tradition created a religious landscape that still defines the region. Borders, too, were shaped by the long struggle. The mountain passes, river valleys, and fortified towns that witnessed centuries of conflict became the reference points for later political boundaries. The strategic geography of the Balkans, shaped by this rivalry, influenced the development of medieval Serbia, Hungary, and other states. When the Second Bulgarian Empire emerged in the 12th century, it rose in many of the same regions that had formed the core of the first. The continuity of place reinforced the continuity of memory. The medieval world rarely drew permanent borders, yet the patterns established by this conflict created a durable sense of territorial identity. The war also reshaped Europe more broadly. Through their interactions, Byzantium and Bulgaria influenced the cultural and political development of neighboring regions. The spread of Slavic literacy, inspired by Bulgarian tradition, contributed to the rise of Orthodox Christianity in Rus. Byzantine diplomacy, honed through centuries of negotiation and conflict, influenced the courts of Western and Central Europe. The Balkans became a crossroads of ideas, faiths, and traditions. The struggle between the two empires accelerated these exchanges, making the region a vital part of the medieval world, rather than a remote frontier. The lesson of endurance echoes strongly through the story of the conflict. Both sides demonstrated remarkable persistence. For Bulgaria, endurance meant resisting the pressure of a larger and better-resourced empire. For Byzantium, endurance meant surviving waves of invasion, internal rebellion, and the rise of powerful rivals. The 200 years of war showed that strength is not measured only in victories. It is measured in the capacity to adapt, to rebuild, and to preserve identity despite hardship. The conflict also revealed a paradox that appears often in history. violence can produce cultural flourishing. The Bulgarian Golden Age emerged during a period of intense rivalry as rulers sought to define their state not only through military power, but through intellectual and spiritual achievement. Byzantium, too, experienced cultural renewal during times of pressure, preserving classical knowledge and developing new forms of art, law, and theology. The tension between war and creativity demonstrates the complexity of human societies. Even in moments of crisis, the human desire to create, learn, and express identity persists. The final lesson of the two-century conflict is simple yet profound. No empire is eternal, but memory is. Byzantium eventually fell to new powers. Bulgaria rose again, fell again, and rose once more. The borders of medieval states shifted countless times, yet the memory of the struggle remained. It survived in chronicles, sermons, songs, and traditions. It shaped national consciousness and influenced future generations. The legacy of the long war endures not because of its battles, but because of the meaning people gave to those battles. The 200 years of conflict between Byzantium and Bulgaria reveal the enduring truth that nations are built on memory as much as power. Armies may conquer, borders may change, and rulers may come and go, but the stories carried by communities survive. Those stories become the foundation upon which new generations build their identity. They connect the present to the past, and transform the struggles of history into lessons for the future. The rivalry that began in the early medieval world continues to resonate because it captures the essence of human endurance. It reflects the capacity of societies to survive hardship, recover strength, and preserve identity. It reminds us that history is not a record of inevitable decline or triumph, but a tapestry woven from resilience, adaptation, and the unbroken chain of memory that links one generation to the next. This is the legacy of the two-century war,